Hello, I'm David Callett, and I'm here with...
Jonathan Rosenbaum. I'm a freelance writer, and I basically have a website at jonathanrosenbaum.com. And I think the way we've worked things out roughly is that David's going to be talking about production history, and I'll be trying to bring some critical perspectives, including the perspectives of other critics who I found especially interesting and helpful.
Yeah, so I guess one of the first things that we should say is that this right here is, at this point, the closest that we've yet come to reconstructing the way the movie looked on January 10th, 1927, at its premiere in Berlin. That was when the film opened at the Ufa Palast am Zoo, which was the name of the theater that Ufa considered its deluxe theater there in Berlin. And on that opening night, it was full of VIPs. There weren't a lot of the ordinary folks there that night. The newspaper said, "Ganz Berlin war da." All of Berlin was there, all the movers and the shakers. And it played in this form, or essentially this form, in Germany through April of 1927.
Yeah, I heard there was even royalty present. It was such a big deal when it opened. Yeah, the interesting thing is that the longer each version has gotten, the more interesting the film has gotten, I think, because for me, my whole way of viewing it has changed once I've understood the kind of things that had been cut out. And, to describe it in a very crude way, the difference is I used to think see the film in a very naive kind of like pseudo-Marxist or pre-Marxist thing about labor relations, when in fact now I'm more inclined to see it as Freudian or post-Freudian even, which is really all about Oedipal traumas and about and it's the importance of the female characters become much more important, obviously. There are two father figures in the story, but there's at least in the novel four mother figures actually. And three in the film. So, and I think that becomes really interesting.
Yeah, for me, one of the things that's fascinating about this, the gradual approach of trying to recreate a definitive version, and the fact that there was this crazy period where if you saw Metropolis twice, you're basically seeing two different movies. That every time you would sit down to it, it'd be a slightly different cut. Is that it emphasizes to what extent this is really a work of pure cinema. What makes this movie so enduring, and the reason that we're sitting here in the 21st century still in love with this film, and it's probably, I would say, the most famous and most popularly accessible silent film of all, is because of the power of its images. Because as you say, all those different cuts do change the story somewhat. If you saw it in the United States when it premiered in 1927 in March, you were seeing a different film with a slightly different story than you saw if you were seeing it in Berlin just a few months earlier. And similarly, if you saw the Giorgio Moroder version, which is the first one that I ever saw, that too was a slightly different story.
It was a different story, and it had even different editing style.
You could change the story. You could make these transformations in the character motivations and what the thrust of the politics were, and yet the movie still worked. That ultimately what makes this movie powerful are the strength of its images and the emotion contained in those images, regardless of what narrative those images are telling.
Right, and I think it's also really fascinating the way the film has cut across almost all barriers in terms of audience. It's very mainstream, it's avant-garde, and in terms of how it's influenced both kinds of cinema. It's hard to think of many other examples of this apart from Charlie Chaplin, who avant-garde artists love. But when you think of the influences this has had, this has influenced everything from music videos to avant-garde theater productions to all kinds of. It really, in terms of design, is probably as important as any film made in terms of the way it's influenced the look of things, and not just in film too.
It was not the first science fiction film by a long shot, but it's in many ways the real grandfather of contemporary science fiction film, because this is the movie that inspired people to follow in its footsteps. That there were other science fiction films before it, but they didn't have the influence that this one did.
Yeah, I think at the same time it's important to say that there's a lot of ways in which seeing it as science fiction has a lot of the negative feelings about it have come from that, and it's important. Actually, Tom Gunning, in my opinion, wrote the most interesting, the best critical study of Lang. called The Films of Fritz Lang, Allegories of Vision and Modernity, which came out about 10 years ago, basically argues, he says a great deal of the disfavor which Metropolis inspires comes simply from an unfamiliarity with allegory, the allegorical mode, an unfamiliarity which often masquerades as judgment about taste and therefore obscures the nature of Harbaugh and Lang's film. And Gunning goes on, he says that Harbaugh herself makes her allegorical claims obvious in the novel's epigraph, which, by the way, is an epigraph that's omitted from many of the English editions, but really claims not to be predicting anything at all. It says, "This book is not of today or of the future. It tells of no place. It serves no cause, party, or class. It has a moral which grows on the pillar of understanding. The mediator between brain and muscle must be the heart."
Yeah. I think that was one of the reasons why H.G. Wells reacted to it the way that he did. There's this famous, H.G. Wells wrote a review of the movie when it opened in America in 1927, and absolutely lambasted it. And this thing's been reprinted in a lot of ways. We'll quote from it later. But I think the subtext of Wells's critique was that he came to it as a true science fiction author. He thought of himself as the kind of person who would imagine what the future was going to be like and try to describe it. And he criticized Lang for what, in his words, he said Lang didn't consult with sociologists and architects and technologists to get a sense of what the future would be like, and he presents all kinds of ridiculous pulp in this that he thought was silly. But if this movie had been an accurate depiction of the future, and different prints have said it takes place in the year 2000 or 2026 or so on or so forth. The movie doesn't actually identify a point in time, but it's often in later prints said to be taking place in the early 21st century. If it really was that way, and we were sitting down and looking and it just looked like a documentary, what would be the point? This is enduring because of the iconic power of these images that are more about art. And that's the thing. Lang did consult with people, but he was consulting with painters, sculptors, and artists who were working in a variety of artistic disciplines and drawing those influences in. He wasn't trying to depict the future. He was trying to
in a way you could say this is a film about 1926.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating as that. I have a friend, a Lang scholar in Germany named Hans Schmidt, who has written me some great stuff. He says, the almost complete version, which he's seen, reminds me of the fact that Lang told trashy stories derived from trashy sources in a very complex and utterly cinematic way. And I think that's true. And indicating in that again, it cuts across things that are, you can say, both very banal and very complex and profound at the same time. So it's very hard to kind of like see it all through a single lens. That's partly what we'll be trying to do, is to bring very different kinds of perspectives on it.
As an example of one of the artists that Lang may have been inspired by, there's this interesting book, and I was showing it to you earlier, and you guys listening to us can't possibly look at it, but it is a book of comparing stills from Fritz Lang's movies of the 1920s to artists that were working contemporaneously in German avant-garde art at the time.
And we're just watching, by the way, 1926 fashions, which is kind of very interesting. It's really like a fashion show of 1926.
But this sequence here has a lot visually in common with an image by Fidus called Der strahlende Quell, which was published in the art magazine Die Jugend in 1906. And not to say that Lang necessarily, or his designers, Erich Kettelhut and Otto Hunti, were drawing from that, but it shows that they were all kind of working in the same artistic milieu.
Well, yes, and he's actually also borrowing them from himself, because there are elements in terms of, I don't know if they're stalagmites or stalactites that were already used in the Nibelungen, which are also in these pleasure gardens. So it's there are a lot of interesting ways. There are images, several images at different points that echo images in the Nibelungen. Yeah, which is the kind of, you were saying before to me, before we started this recording, which is very interesting, that Lang saw the Metropolis as kind of like the third part of a trilogy consisting of Mebuza, which was the present, the Nibelungen, which was the past, and then Metropolis, which is the future. But again, it's important to see it in I think Gunning's terms as an allegory about the future,
Yeah.
not as a prediction of the future.
Right.
And part of the notion of the allegory, which is very important, which is emphasized for Gunning, is that it's about the overtaking of society by the machine and the whole fear about that, and what all that means, particularly in relationship to the fact that cinema itself is something that comes out of a machine, and Lang himself is like, a person who looks down on this world the same way that the industrialist is looking down, in the same way that Mabuse and other films are, like controlling the characters. So it's him kind of like contemplating his own cinematic resources in some ways. That some of that is coming into what this film is about.
And another way of seeing this as a movie that's really more about 1926 than it is about the future is that this notion of a divided class system where the workers live underground and the privileged live above ground, you see that same imagery in the movie Aelita, Queen of Mars, which came out 1924, I think, was when it was released.
Right, a Russian
film, and it had been popular around the world, and presumably it influenced the filmmakers in this in some regard. But it's got a lot of very similar imagery, including a sequence where the workers on Mars are seen to be fed into a machine, much like the sequence we're coming up to with the M machine that Frater discovers in the underground city. But that idea that the class divisions would break apart ultimately kind of into two different races. And you see the same thing in H.G. Wells' Time Machine, which was first published in 1908. Those are things that were very pressing on people living in the early part of the 20th century. If somebody sat down to make a movie like Metropolis today, that's not going to be the first thing they think about. They're not going to build their society around class divisions. There might be other kinds of divisions, racial divisions or something like that. But these were the issues that worried people in the 20s. And so naturally it becomes the understructure of their science fiction.
Yeah, one thing that's very interesting, by the way, in terms of the gender politics of this, which are very, the whole movie, which are very strange, is that you already have the two sort of poles, which is, like a Madonna and a whore, but you don't have any other kind of women.
Right.
And in fact, except that they're all mothers in one way or another, and in fact, what's so interesting about Maria, who you just met, is that she's both very clearly a virgin and a mother figure. So she's like the Virgin Mary.
That was the wording in Theo von Harbou's novel, which was written just before the screenplay. It was written contemporaneously with the screenplay, but published beforehand. The phrasing was the sweet countenance of the Virgin, the loving countenance of the mother, something like that, where every time Maria is mentioned, she mentions Virgin and Mother in the same breath.
And and I think the whole idea of the mother is one of the things that got most suppressed in the original American version, because the hero's mother is Hel, who we later are going to see this huge monument to. Is sort of like the mother of all, the major mother figure. But in a sense, in the novel, which was, by the way, as run as originally as a serial in a newspaper, so even that's in different versions. The grandmother of the hero is an important character also. And in fact, even the last chapter of the novel is a scene between the father and her, not the scene that's in the movie. So it's funny, one thing I think we should try to get clear. There's a lot to write about, talk about right here.
Yeah.
So maybe we should put that off to later. But it does seem to me that there's a very unfortunate way in which people have always said that the good stuff in this movie is ascribable to Lang and the bad stuff to von Harbour. Lang himself denied this, and I think we have to kind of talk about this in more depth, because I don't think it's a...
Yeah, I do want to come back to that virgin and whore dichotomy and the Lang versus von Harbour, because there's other things to say. But you're right, we're talking over the Moloch machine. This is huge, man.
This is part of the visionary aspect, and it's more visionary certainly than science fiction. I think that's an important point to make.
And it's the second time that Lang has returned to this imagery of a machine turning into the devouring Moloch god, because of course it was in the finale of Dr. Mabuse the Gambler back in 1922. The premise behind a lot of the special effects techniques in this movie are very similar to things he'd done before, but the accomplishment behind them has advanced substantially. This is really the pinnacle of special effects technique of the 20s. Oh, right there we had the first of what are 3 tracking shots in the film. There's one in each of the acts. Each one of them is centered around Freighter. And you see production photos, they had this big dolly and the camera was set up and Lang would be sitting on it, perched like a vulture, and they would push this thing towards actor Gustav Froelich. So that was the first of the 3.
Yeah, I think it's, God, it's sort of like that devouring aspect comes out an awful lot in the novel too, in terms of the way it's describing it. It's a very simple kind of concept. And you know what's interesting is this no longer looks like it's modern, it looks like it's ancient. And I think that that's very important. The whole idea of the Tower of Babel, which is going to be evoked soon, is one of the kind of contradictions of this film. It's as much about the past as it is about the future. Although you could see it almost in psychoanalytical terms with, you know, the underground, subterranean being like the subconscious, and I suppose, you know, you can say the far above ground being the superego, and, you know, things like this. There are lots of ways you can sort of look at it that way.
Do you know much about the legends of the Moloch? The myth behind it?
No, I don't.
I don't know that much either. I know the idea was that it was a cannibalistic god, and there were a number of different civilizations that believed in it, but that's kind of the limit of my ignorance.
Yes, but it is clear, though, that I think that Harbaugh especially brought a lot of different aspects of different religions into her work, and especially here. There are lots of echoes and things from different cultures and so on. And
there's more religious discussion and symbolism in the book than there even is in the movie.
Yeah. I think if we want to talk about, as some do, like it's very important to. There's certain aspects that are very important to know. I mean, of course, that Lang and Harbaugh were married, but they, according to, you know, they didn't get divorced until 1933. But according to von Harbaugh, it took them. That they were only really married in a serious way for 1 year, and it took 10 more years because they were too busy to get a divorce. And I think part of the reason why the point is she's regarded much more campier. I mean, in a way, almost like as a kind of Ayn Rand figure in some ways. But at the same time, you know, like something is, she worked on films as sophisticated as M, for example, which nobody sees as campy. I think she has a lot of range, actually.
This was a transition point in her personality. Before this movie was made, she tended to dress very frumpily and had this kind of matronly aspect to her. And the co-workers who worked on this film, they noted that when they started coming to the set for Metropolis, she was dressing in short skirts, she cut her hair real short. She was really trying to look like a more modern woman.
Well, that's really interesting. And one thing I heard that's kind of anecdotally very funny is that she dictated I think both, I don't know if the novel, but but the script certainly, that it was maybe in both cases she dictated it, and she was knitting while she did it in order to help her concentrate.
She would make soup and cocoa for the cast and crew. She would bring in food to people. You know, so she really acted like a mother figure on the set as well.
That's interesting. I know that her brother took all these production photos too. Many of those that we have were taken by him.
So now we're meeting the head of Metropolis, played by Alfred Abel, and there's an interesting distinction in acting styles that I want to point out here, because there was an article written for the website AV Club a while back by Mike D'Angelo, who was talking about why it is silent films are difficult for contemporary audiences to access. That it's even easier for people to watch pre-code films that are right on the edge of that silent transition, but it's like the crossover into silent there's a Rubicon that's very difficult even for a lot of cineasts to cross, and that the world of silent film fandom is a subset of film geeks. And it was his thesis that the problem is that silent films are marred by this very exaggerated acting, this broad gestures that makes it hard to for contemporary audiences to identify with the characters because they seem very cartoony. And he singled out as his example Gustav Fröhlich's performance here in Metropolis. And certainly everything Fröhlich does is all exclamation points, and he runs.
But he's a bad actor. I think the point is that some of the others, Bridget Helms, who was only 17, plays Maria, is like an extraordinary performance.
I absolutely.
And I think we have to also realize that Fröhlich was a last-minute replacement.
Yes, he was a reporter who was originally cast as one of the workers, and the guy who was, I don't know the name of the actor who was originally cast in the freighter role, just wasn't working out, and Theo von Harbu singled Fröhlich out and said, this guy looks great, and Lang was persuaded because he realized he didn't need an actor. What he needs is a moldable human figurine, because in as an expressionistic a movie as this is, the actor's gestures are part of the mise en scène. What Lang wants are these exaggerated performances, and Alfred Abel is distinguishing himself with a much more subdued performance. He came out of a stage tradition. He was one of the Max Reinhardt protégés, and had an incredibly accomplished stage career before he started making movies. And then he made hundreds of movies with all of the great directors. I've been kind of down on him in the past, but I've come to realize that my negative reaction to him is often a case of my reacting to the way his roles are written. The more movies I see him in, the more I realize he's got an incredible range.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to see that there's a kind of one of the things that's really interesting about Lang's work is that the most important character is usually not the hero, which is a paradox.
Right.
But the point is, a lot of the negative feelings about this film come from the fact that the hero is sort of ridiculous, and there's no getting around it.
Yeah.
And it's partly because of the casting, but it's also because this kind of wimpy character. He's, even the fact that he gets involved in, you could say, political concerns is really undercut in the novel. In the novel, his concern for the workers, by own admission, is entirely a matter of libido rather than conscience or politics. Let me just quote briefly from what a little speech that he makes to Maria, which is quite interesting. He says, "To you, Maria, I will not make myself out to you to be better than I am. I want to come to you, Maria, and I want you. I love mankind, not for its own sake, but for your sake, because you love it. I do not want to help mankind for its own sake, but for your sake, because you wish it. Yesterday I did good to two men. I helped one whom my father had dismissed, and I did the work of the man whose uniform I have on. This was my way to you. God bless you." So he doesn't even care about the political issues. He's just got the hots for her. And I think he's kind of ineffectual in everything he does. I think that's an important thing to realize. Whereas the real characters running the show, the deities, you could even say, are all women. And even this guy in the novel is kind of like subservient to his own mother, and who hasn't forgiven him, and who's still a broken man because his wife loves somebody else. And, it's sort of like...
There's a lot that goes on with the Jo Fredersen character that doesn't really come across in the movie, because it's almost too complicated for a silent film to get across. In the novel, there's really the sense that he's this godlike figure who's created the city of Metropolis, and he wants to destroy it because it disappoints him in order for his son to redeem it. I mean, there's a very religious allegory going on there. And you don't get that impression.
No, but I think it's important to see him being a lot like Mabuse in the Fritz Lang films, which means a lot like Lang himself.
Yeah,
in other words, the one person who could see everything, who has the vision of everything. And I think that's very important. And Lang himself is always critical towards this figure. It's never like he sort of like if identifies with him, it's in a very ironic and self-critical way.
Speaking of the politics of Frater's involvement in the underground, in the Channing Pollock cut, and especially the one that was cut down from it later, so the one that most Americans saw during the middle part of the 20th century, there was no impression that... the way they set it up was that the head of Metropolis, Jo Fredersen, in the American cuts is called Masterman, that Masterman was upset that his son had been down in the catacombs. How was he allowed to go down in the catacombs? Now that's an intertitle that doesn't appear here, because in this version it's taken for granted people know about the treatment of the workers down below, they just don't care, rather than in that altered version, it's that, he goes chasing after Maria, discovers, oh my goodness, look what's going on down here. It's a little harsher in the original cut. The idea that people would just be so callously dismissive of the workers, and that it's something special about Frater that he becomes involved in people that he starts to consider his brothers.
One of the things, by the way, that I was going to say before about gender politics, which is very strange about this movie, is that the workers are all men, except for the very latter part of the film. And it's so, in other words, that as I say, all the women that you see who are characters are exclusively Madonnas and whores. That's the only possibility.
Yeah,
so you can't, even though you can say that there's something very female about Harbu's influence, it's not exactly feminist.
No, and that's what I think. I think von Harbu is the source of that virgin versus whore dichotomy, because it comes up a lot in the stories that she was writing, both for Lang and scripts she wrote for other directors. Once Lang comes off to Hollywood, that disappears from his films. And throughout his Hollywood career, you see movies like Woman in the Window and Scarlet Street and The Big Heat and Human Desire, Rancho Notorious, Clash by Night. Over and over again, he's got these highly sexualized and somewhat amoral heroines, and there's no other figure. It's like he gets rid of the virgins and just goes all whores.
Well, and in Manhunt, you could say he combines the Madonna and whore into the same figure, you could say, which happens sometimes too. I don't know if you could say that he certainly doesn't exactly become a feminist, but he kind of like steps away from the extremes that you get in some of the earlier films. But it's interesting that in the very, he reverts to the idea of the woman deity, and his very late films, which are scripted originally by von Harbu, Thagler of Veshnapur and the Indian tomb, or the Hindu tomb, because you actually see this enormous, like face of a goddess, which is very similar to what you're going to see later of like the monument to Hel, the mother of the hero, who died giving childbirth. I mean, basically giving birth to the hero.
I want to mention the actor who's playing Josaphat, who's about to get fired, is Theodor Loos, and he was a member of Lang's regular company. Shows up in some of Lang's later films. He plays King Gunther in The Nibelungen. He's Lohmann's assistant in M. He's Dr. Baum's assistant in The Testament of Dr. Mabuse. And you were talking about the doubling of figures.
Right, now he's this person, right? He's not the one with the beard.
No, that's another actor. No, it's this guy here in the suit. He's the person that Jo Fredersen kicks out, and in order to then rely on Slim, and then he's the person that Frater brings in, and Slim tries to take him away. So he and Slim are double figures as assistants.
Yes, and it's important to also note that there's a lot more about Josaphat, this character, in the novel than there is in the film.
And there's certainly a lot more in this version of the film than there was previously.
There's a lot of what this version does, since it's so close to the original, but just short of a few minutes, is it gives us all the connective tissue.
Yeah.
So that these transitions are not as wrenching because we see the plot connections, and sometimes even it becomes a little more tedious following them through. But I think, but at the same time, it's more coherent, which is interesting. It's kind of like when we had a longer version of Touch of Evil, for example. We got to see the physical layout better, and that's also true. In other words, we can, in terms of but it's even more in terms of the plot.
Yeah.
We kind of understand what place certain things have, what characters have, and so the place certain characters have in the design of the plot.
Just a technical point to explain what you're seeing. Obviously, occasionally, the picture quality jumps down significantly, and that is the newly added footage that was restored for this edition. And then occasionally you'll also see brief little flashes of black. The image just goes dark for just a moment. And what's happening there is that's where footage is known to supposed to be there, but doesn't currently exist.
I see.
And it's not a long enough scene to be substituted with a title card. There are two big scenes, Maria's escape from Rotvang and a sequence with the monk in the Gothic church that don't exist, and that's the bulk of the missing footage from this version. Otherwise, the material that's missing are just tiny little intercut shots, and the reason we know where they're supposed to be is because of the score that Gottfried Huppertz was contracted to compose a score that was supposed to be performed at the film. At that January 10th premiere, there was a 75-piece orchestra that people were playing. Even when the Channing Pollock cut the movie down, they cut the Huppertz score to match it, to go along with it. The Huppertz score has the scene list written alongside it. So when the restoration team find new footage and put it all back together again, they can use that as the written document to tell them where things are supposed to go.
Well, yes, and I think it's important to know that the new footage that you see, which is of inferior quality, comes from a 16mm dupe of a print that was miraculously discovered in Buenos Aires, actually, that had originally was a copy of a print that had belonged to a collector for many years.
Yeah.
And then that copy isn't gone, but the 16mm dupe is what they had to work with, and it was in terrible condition. So they did a rather remarkable job, but they obviously can't bring it to the same visual quality as the rest of it.
One of the contractors who worked at a software company that did the visual processing said that of all of the damaged footage that he'd had to deal with in the past, if you set a scale, 1 being the least damaged and 10 being the most damaged, that the footage they found in Buenos Aires was a 25.
Yes.
And really, what they were presented with wasn't a restoration challenge, it's a PR challenge, because people have been hungry for this footage for so long, and then you do it on Blu-ray. It's like you're painting a target on your chest for people to say, well, how come it looks so bad?
Yeah.
The problem is that the best technology that can be brought to restoring old films comes down to signal-to-noise ratio, and ideally, the signal is the stuff that you want. It's the picture like it would look right now. And the noise would be dirt and scratches and damage on top of that. And you would want to be able to strip as much of the noise away and have the signal underneath. The problem with this Buenos Aires footage is that all of those scratches and dirt and nitrate damage, that's printed into it. That's now part of the signal.
Yeah.
There's no way to take it out.
But I think there's a way in which one could, maybe not even that perversely, appreciate that, because it is an old film, and we should recognize it as that, and it's a historical object, in a certain way, and in a way we're seeing a layered text, because we're seeing parts that were revived and restored or persisted for different periods.
Yeah. Well, for me, one of the fascinations is that the footage in Buenos Aires, it had been there all along. It's not like somebody dug into a swimming pool and suddenly discovered, hey, we got a big vault of film down here. Oh, look, it's Metropolis. What had happened was when Channing Pollock, and we can discuss this later, when the changes were made for the American version, those were then exported back to Europe. So everybody got the cut version or some variant of it.
And they assumed that this was the cut version.
Right, but they had sold it to Argentina prior to those cuts. It just wasn't distributed yet. So it starts its theatrical run in Argentina in May of 1928. Well, anybody looking at the dates is going to say, oh, well, that's going to be another copy of the cut version. But in fact, it was the uncut version. And then this collector you mentioned, Manuel Peña Rodriguez, got hold of it. Instead of the distributor sending it back to UFA like they were supposed to, it's World War II, and the contracts are no longer really enforceable. So it ends up in this private collector's hands. He knows he's got something special. By the 1970s, it's starting to deteriorate, so he has that 16mm print made, eventually sells his collection to the Musée du Cinéma there. And the museum doesn't realize just how special it was. They just say, oh, it's Metropolis. Put it on the shelf, and it's only 2008. Somebody looks at it and goes, hey, wow, this thing's been sitting here for 80 years, and it's what we've been looking for. If when they first started the process of restoring Metropolis, the process of restoring Metropolis began in the 1970s, if their first step was to go to Argentina, they could have gotten the complete version right from the beginning and saved all the effort.
Yeah. Well, but things are always so haphazard in film, and what we kind of like, what's lost, what we still have.
Yeah.
It's and it's the way that studios act today.
Yeah.
As so haphazard and arbitrary that it's going to continue to be like this.
Yeah. Well, the discovery of Murnau's silent version of City Girl, that thing was just sitting on the shelf at Fox, but it was mislabeled as a completely different film. And it was a film archivist who opened it up and looked at it and realized what it really was. So that kind of discovery happens all the time.
Yeah, and in that, reversed kind of like what everybody thought the film was, because everybody was saying that all that existed was something that was totally compromised, and
This is one of my favorite restored shots, because otherwise you get the impression that the M machine is just in this cavernous hall, and all it is a working space. And the idea that there's a street alongside it, and you could sit on a park bench and watch him, that Slim could actually be seeing what's going on, is kind of stunning.
Yeah, I find Slim the most sinister of all the villains in this film.
Yeah, he's played
so
by
creepy.
Fritz Rasp, who just, I would have been ashamed to be like Fritz Rasp's wife or something, because he just looks like such a creep. He plays the pharmacist who seduces Louise Brooks in Diary of a Lost Girl, and he plays similarly sinister figures in a number of Lang's later films as well.
Yeah, something I think is worth maybe pointing out here. In Thomas L. Sasser's book on Metropolis in the BFI Film Classic series, he talks about how all the complaints of technocrats about this film. And let me just quote from the way he paraphrases it. Just because I think it's barking up the wrong tree. This is so metaphysical, obviously. But why did the cars look like yesterday's models? Why were there fixed stairs and no escalators? Why was automation resulting in exhausting and dangerous work for men rather than leading to monotonous but light and safe tasks, increasingly employing women? Where in Metropolis was the middle management? And where were the politicians, the police, or security forces? To see workers exert huge physical effort manning a machine incensed every engineer, not only because it did not correspond to the facts of modern factory conditions, but because the very purpose of machines was to reduce industry's dependency on manual labor. And several reviews explained why just about every piece of machinery shown in the film was non-functional, anachronistic, and nonsensical, even from the point of view of the rulers. And of course, the most vituperative was H.G. Wells.
Yeah.
But this is like, this is kind of like, is en route to this very weird, evil nightclub called Yoshiwa. And it's important to talk about that a little bit, because I think that if one wants to talk about, pre-Nazi stuff, there's a lot of racial ideas associated with Rashiwar. That part of the idea of sin is the idea of miscegenation. It's very pronounced in the novel as well as and it even comes out in the longer versions of the film too. But it's in fact, there's the proprietor of the Yoshiwa in the novel, who's called September, is defined by the fact that he's a mixture of so many races, and people have to guess, what his parentage is. And this is all seen almost like part and parcel with the fact that you see, the implication that this is where gay people hang out. This is where all this licentiousness. See the black person there already.
Yeah.
It's very. You can really see that this is kind of a real portrait of 1926 high living.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the future, but it's very much has a lot to do with the metaphysics of this film. And the whole moral ideas about morality, which are very old-fashioned, in fact.
And it's a very old-fashioned thought also to sort of project your sin onto some other culture, to say that there are going to be bad parts of town, but it's where the immigrants live. It's not the pureborns aren't going to behave that way unless they're seduced.
That's why it has a Japanese name, and etc. So, and this is like another thing that's a contradiction about something in science fiction. This is like this Gothic like cottage in the middle of this modern metropolis.
Right, and the book talks about how this is the house where this magician who walked around in red shoes used to live, and Rotvang purchased the house after the magician died. So it's that fusion of science with magic, the idea that the mad scientist in the movie is a wizard.
Well, there's a very interesting comment that was made when 2001, Kubrick's film came out. Annette Michelson wrote that a major problem with most science fiction films that the Kubrick avoided was that their vision of the future eventually collapses into Gothic imagery. And you could even say that they're there all the way through in things like as like Flash Gordon and Star Wars and so on. They're there from the beginning. Here is hell.
And this is, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think this is an important point to say while it's briefly on the screen, because this is the reason, or one of the reasons, why the American version was so radically transformed.
Yes.
That name right there caused Channing Pollock, fits of mental spasms. So what happened was the producers at Paramount didn't want to deal with a 150-minute long movie. They bring in American playwright Channing Pollock and say, you got to cut this thing down, get it around 10 reels. And one of the first things he alights on is the problem with this name, that Americans are going to see the name Hell, and it's going to provoke, nervous laughter.
H-E-L-L.
Who is at Hell?
Exactly.
But in German, that name That references bright light. Helles Licht would be like heavenly light. If anything, it references like Helen of Troy. So it's just purity and light. And the only way that he could think of to get rid of the name, because it's written on the statue, was cut out all shots of the statue.
Right, and it's very important because this is like the ultimate deity in the film.
Yeah.
It's like everything kind of leads back to hell. I mean, in terms of the men are only, whether they're happy or unhappy is all because of, because of her ultimately, and her approval or lack of approval. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's her, posthumous letter, delivered letter, forgiving her husband that is the last mm-hmm. thing in the novel, unlike the scene that's in the film.
And here, the idea is presented that Rotvang has built the robot as a way of reincarnating her.
Yeah.
And that's an idea that doesn't necessarily show up in the other versions. It's certainly not in the cuts that get rid of Hel as a character, and it's not in the novel. But here, it's very explicitly stated, I've done this so that she can live again.
Yes. And he's sort of very interesting because, all right, he's in a way, there's a good father and a bad father, sort
mm-hmm.
of. And he's the bad father, more
yeah.
than, and it's almost like the first major mad scientist in movies. And he's really a figure that relates to medieval. I mean, he's like in some ways like Merlin. Mm-hmm. He's also, when I was talking about racial ideas, he's been compared to some Jewish figures, and I think that's kind of interesting. There's a critic I can quote from later who talks about this, and specifically in relationship to him.
Well, they've made a point of putting the 5-pointed star on all of the doors of his house, and that's the only. It's the only. Right there we go. Got the star right there.
Yes, that's right. So it's not quite like the Jewish Star of
right.
David, but it's not.
But it has some of those evocations.
Yeah, it's in terms of this kind of esoteric ideas, that are inform the script. He is but he's also shown in a rather complex way of being very troubled because of
yeah.
his own love for Hel and wanting. And when she died, the appearance was that she loved him and not her husband. Right. So, and he lost his hand. He has an artificial mm-hmm. hand because of her. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, that's one of the things that. One of the most famous things that was borrowed from another film in Dr. Strangelove. Mm-hmm. Dr. Strangelove, artificial hand. Yeah. Played, Peter Sellers,
and
is a direct reference to this character.
Luke Skywalker's artificial hand in Star Wars is, again, a similar idea.
So, the idea that this character is modeled after Hel is very important, too. So it's the whole idea of the fear of machines taking over the world, which is central to the allegory. And even central to the idea, even about Lang looking at cinema, is somehow epitomized also in the way the machinery becomes sexualized. And this is true throughout the film. When you see all those pumping and machines at the very beginning, there's something very sexual about them. And and of course this becomes even more clear when out of this character emerges later the false Maria. Right. Who's sort of like the evil side of machinery and of sexuality and so on.
It's fascinating to me that why would he make the robot is another of the narrative transformations between the different cuts. You'd think that wouldn't change, but they've got the footage, he's got a robot, but then they changed the intertitles to give him different reasons. And in the Channing Pollock cut, because they get rid of the idea that he's building the robot as a way of reincarnating Hel, they come up with the alternate suggestion, and here is the actual title card from the Channing Pollock cut. He says, "My work is done. A machine that can be made to look like a man or a woman, but never tires, never makes a mistake. Now we can do without living workers." So in that version, it's explicitly he is making this so they can replace all the workers with robots. And then critics attacked it. So, well, if that's the case, and all the workers are men, why does the robot look like a woman? And then what's funny is that in the book, the idea is that he had been assigned by Fredersen to make artificial workers, and then on his own went and made it look like a woman because, that would be more interesting. And now you have this sexy female tool that can be used for other purposes as well. And
and of course, both these men are totally hung up on hell,
Yeah.
so it has to do with that
Right.
obsession.
But so the book, which comes first, is that juncture between the way it's presented in the movie, which is all about reincarnating hell and making a woman on purpose, and the Channing Pollock cut, which is all about making workers. It's like both of those two things have their roots in the novel.
Yes, I think by the way, it's important to bring up something about the actor playing Rotwang, Rudolf Klein-Raga. It gives you a very interesting subtext to know that he was actually the former husband of Theo von Harbo, and that he also plays the villain in several other long silent films. He's Attila the Hun in The Nibelungen, he's Dr. Mabuse, and he's the Mabuse-like villain Hagi in Spies. So there's a really interesting kind of way that Long casts him in these roles. And he's very good in them, I think, too.
One of the things that's interesting about the process of putting this movie back to its original form is that things that used to seem like rather daring pieces of avant-garde cutting are gradually getting bleached out of the movie. And this is an example of one of them, especially in the Giorgio Moroder cut, and to a lesser extent in the Channing Pollock cut. When Frater looks at the map there, that is intercut very directly with the map being looked at by Rotwang. There's parallel cutting back and forth,
Yes.
and it's simultaneous. And they don't quite do it that way in this original cut. It's a little bit more leisurely. It's less of it's still kind of there, but not as overt as it is. And I think that's something to look out for as you compare the different versions against each other. There are a couple of examples of cuts that seem really, really on the edge of montage technique that turn out to have been additions to later versions of the film.
Yeah. Incidentally, one thing that could argue on behalf of Long having a lot to do with this story rather than Harbo is the fact that my friend Hans Schmidt wrote to me this really interesting material about a lost film that Long wrote. It was made in 1919. And let me just quote you what he says. The Metropolis story, of course, is von Harbo and Long. And did you ever hear of the lost film Lilith and Lee? It was shot in 1919 in Austria. Long had written the screenplay. A long synopsis is all that remains. So one knows that there was a scientist with a subterranean laboratory. The scientist invents the visual surveillance system, which will then be used by Leo Schahn, the Spiders, by Friedrichsen in Metropolis, and by Mabuse in the last Mabuse film, Thousand Eyes of Dr. Mabuse. And a statue of the ideal woman, which is imbued with life by the scientist, more by Indian magic than by Western science, it seems. The artificial woman turns out to be a vamp like the second Maria in Metropolis, in this case a real blood-sucking vampire. In Long's screenplay from 1919, the two Marias are called Lilith, the bad artificial woman, and Lee, the good woman of flesh and blood, and there's a capitalist business enterprise, the Syndicate, which is interested in the scientist's inventions. There are early versions of Friedrichsen and Rodwig, in other words. So I think that's really interesting. If all of this comes from Long at an earlier stage, then in a sense, Harbo is investing her own personality on parts of it, but a lot of it is coming from Long as well. And he made a point of sort of like saying that he was 50% responsible for everything. That it was, we can't just say, as people have made fun of, that everything bad in the film could be ascribed to that Nazi bitch, as Tom Cutting put it. It's kind of becomes laughable because in fact, Long was, even though he apologized for things that he thought were silly in the film, he said that I'm partly responsible for them.
I find that story about Lilith and Life fascinating because, of course, there's the legend that Lang would later tell that he and Eric Palmer, the producer of the film, had been in New York. They go to New York for the premiere of The Nibelungen, and that it was while they were in Ellis Island waiting to be processed into the city that they were sort of held as overnight for some reason, and he was looking out at the New York skyline and was inspired to do Metropolis, and he comes back and does Metropolis. And then people debunk this, pointing out, well, that trip was in October of 1924, and the script was already written in July of 1924, and there were early production meetings about it back in April of 24, so the process was well underway before he goes to New York. And what you're pointing out is that the process was well underway. You skip back 10 years.
That's right. Yeah, and in fact, it's quite possible. Apparently, they saw a lot of the Manhattan skyline for the first time because they had visa problems getting off the boat. But so that might have influenced some of the visual ideas about the city. But it wasn't the original idea of Metropolis by a long shot. It's so important to think about the fact that underground caves, that are dank and full of skeletons and everything, crop up constantly in Lang's later films.
Yeah.
They're kind of constant, and in different forms. It's a kind of like a visual trope that's very important to him.
And it's more of that queasy collusion between the gothic horror and the shiny sci-fi.
Yes, that's right. About. It's almost like the. But it has the sense of, like the repressed. The repressed history, repressed, like working class labor.
I love the staging of this shot, because if you think about it, if people were really walking into a room, the people at the front of the room are going to go to the front of the room, and the people who come in last are going to end up at the back. But he's got it the exact opposite. The first people in stop at the back, the next people stop in front of them. So it's this triangulation that pushes Gustav Froelich out to the very front of the screen.
Oh, yeah.
So it gets him not only big in the frame, but he's right up there to make eye contact with Maria.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting visual stuff in this portion of the film I think we should talk about. It's, in a lot of ways, not just, like the kind of abstract way those crosses and those little... And in fact, I don't even know what those little holes are that are, and behind them that's really interesting. That makes you think of Native American, cliff dwellings and things like this. But she's giving this sermon, and this is interesting about, again, a woman associated with religious ideas. All the religious ideas are, she's John the Baptist as well as the Virgin Mary.
Yes.
It's like, and she's giving a sermon about the Tower of Babel, which is also. It's not only basic to some of the ideas of the film, but it's basic to... And while this film came out, Lang wrote an article in which he said, I think let me just quote from it, "The internationalism of film language will become the strongest instrument available for the mutual understanding of peoples who otherwise have such difficulty understanding each other in all too many languages. To bestow upon film the double gift of ideas and soul is the task that lies before us. We will realize it." So that's the dream that leads to, of course, the Tower of Babel, or at least it's related to the Tower of Babel, because the idea is the different languages come from the construction of this tower, and he's seeing it as a positive thing and not as a negative thing. Now, one thing that's really interesting in terms of the imagery of this sequence is the way 5 figures keep appearing like the fingers of a hand. You can see it here. You can see it in many of the shots where you have individual figures, that you get the idea of the 5 fingers. It crops up in various ways. And it just shows you how organized the imagery of, this is in relationship to metaphorical ideas and so on.
And one of the things about making that imagery so organized was the interrelationship between the different members of the production team. And the crew joked that not just did the heart, the hands and the head needed the mediator of the heart, that Lang and Junta needed the mediator of Erich Kettelhut, that Lang and Otto Junta fought bitterly throughout this movie. And so when they were designing the Tower of Babel, there was one end of the production team that wanted it to look like the Bruegel painting from 1563. And then there was another end of the production team that they wanted to think, well, what's going to be the most logical way for this building to look if it was built by slaves dragging blocks in this way? What would it actually have looked like? And
there's the 5 fingers. There's the 5 fingers.
Yeah. And so in the end, Lang goes, well, make it look like the Bruegel painting. It doesn't matter what would really happen. We want it to look, so it's immediately evocative. You look at it, that's the Tower of Babel.
Yeah. So many interesting, like behind scene stories. It's interesting that Kettelhut was actually, I think, married to the costume designer who had lots of problems with Lang.
Oh, yeah, they fought. It's a wonder she even worked on the movie in the first place, and then he treated her like crap all through it.
So this evokes the whole idea of the building of the pyramids and things like Land of the Pharaohs. At least to me, that's what it evokes.
760 extras playing those slaves.
Well, so they said. I wonder about that because they use all these kinds of tricks in a lot of these shots. Right. So you wonder. It's because they said they had trouble, shaving all these heads, So they obviously had to resort to some trickery.
Yeah.
And there you get 5 at the bottom, but then the one at the top, so that there's a kind of graphic juxtaposition.
Yeah. The production of the film took place over the course of longer than a year. It ran from May of 25 through October of 26.
Right, 310 working days and 60 nights.
And most of those working days were 14 or 16-hour days. It was a very long slog. And it was the most expensive film made in Germany to that date. Reported budget of 6 million marks.
Which is way over what they originally figured on. But maybe it would be good. Why don't you talk a little bit about, because I think this is an important thing, the Parafumet Agreement of December, was it 25?
Yeah.
That's very important about how this film came about.
Absolutely, because when Erich Palmer came into the head of UFA, he had a specific remit of improving exports, because the problem that UFA was facing, in 1923, German films occupied about 60% of the available screens in theaters, and the other 40% were imports, mostly from Hollywood. By 1926, when this film's in production, that had completely reversed. 60% of the films in theaters were Hollywood imports, and only 40% were German films. UFA was running operating losses of about 40 million Reichsmarks. It was a very difficult time, but Palmer's strategy had always been the way to carve out a niche for German films abroad was to make them these huge spectacles that Hollywood wasn't doing. If Hollywood was focusing on highly realistic films, then German films should be these glorious fantasies. And so he was very instrumental in cultivating the idea of German Expressionism as a brand identity for UFA films. And he was a soft touch. He would let Fritz Lang and F.W. Murnau and other directors just write whatever checks they wanted to make their films. He did not put budgetary constraints on them, except when absolutely necessary, because he wanted them to do the things that would make those films exportable to Hollywood. But it got to the point where things were just in an absolute state of decrepitude financially. So he goes to Paramount and Metro, and they strike a deal whereby Paramount and Metro together will invest 4 million marks in UFA. I mean, they're running operating losses of close to 40
million. And that's where, the name Parafumet comes from Paramount, UFA, and Metro.
So it's a tiny little amount of money, but it was the money they were going to put towards Metropolis.
Yeah.
And in return, what UFA's giving them is they're promising 75% of the theater capacity of UFA's theater chain. So they're just cutting out their heart to make this possible. But the idea was to make a movie such an impressive blockbuster that it would break into the American marketplace, and instead of worrying about selling German films in Germany, it was going to be about selling German films in America. That was the whole point of this movie. Make a blockbuster that you could sell to America.
Well, it's interesting that even though it was a flop when it came out, it's had so many revivals that you almost wonder if by now it's sort of like made back its... which is kind of like the story of Orson Welles' career. It's sort of like all of his flops eventually made money, because over the years, it's just that they've not right away.
Well, Palmer was kicked out of UFA during the production of this film because the financial situation had just gotten so dire, and they felt that, especially as regards the expenses on Metropolis, that he was not exercising any discretion in reining Lang back. So he was fired.
That's kind of like George Schaefer and Orson Welles.
And then when the movie came out and it failed, the board of directors get together and they sign a resolution saying, we will never work with Fritz Lang again. And that's not enough for them. They have to scribble in the margins, handwritten into the resolution, we'll never work with Fritz Lang again. They write by hand, and if we meet him in person, we'll be rude to him.
Well, he was apparently pretty tough on actors, on technicians. He was... No, that's the thing. He wasn't. That's the interesting thing about him. Even though he had very moral positions, certainly later when he became more developed politically, he was a tyrant and a dictator.
And this experiment didn't work. I mean, the film did not make the beachhead into the American marketplace, and UFA went basically under and was bought out by a publishing company that was allied with the Nationalist Party, explicitly to get access to the UFA theater chain to use for propaganda purposes. So this is the movie that destroyed UFA.
Well, it's funny, yeah, but you can also think about so many of the films that were most influenced by Metropolis. The same thing happened to. Think about Blade Runner, which owes so much to this film, which was a total flop when it came out, and now is considered a classic. And you know, I think it's entirely possible that the same thing might happen eventually with AI, artificial intelligence, because that's another movie. It's certainly badly received, but I think very much indebted to Metropolis. I think especially in the linking of the whole idea of the robot with the idea of cinema, with the idea of bringing sort of life to an inanimate material, and how much that's about cinema as well, and in terms of even the kind of ambivalent feelings we have about it. Even though, and again, a film very badly received at first, but I think it's, personally, it's a film I think that's quite a great one, although I know most people disagree with me about it.
In the Channing Pollock cut, what's interesting is that there's no distinction made between Fredersen's instructions to the robot and any possible vengeful interference by Rottweiler. Whereas in this cut, we have not one evil plot, but two. And it's that complication that in some ways muddies the storytelling here. And it makes, I think, complicated at the end about which characters get punished for what. They burn the robot at the stake, and Rottweiler gets thrown off the top of the cathedral, but Fredersen gets forgiven.
Yeah, it's funny. There's a very interesting thing by the critic Anton Case about this, so it's worth reading. About the ending. He said, "Who then is left out of the harmonious ending? It is Rottweiler, dressed like an Eastern Jew, or like Rabbi Lowe in Paul Wegener's 1920s The Golem, and the female robot who was burnt at the stake, eliminating the double threat of a, quote, scheming Jewish scientist, unquote, and the new woman as femme fatale, both of them marked as menacing outsiders, means within the narrative logic of the film, eliminating the archetypes of cold rationality and uncontrollable sexuality, both seen as mortal dangers to the spirit of the community. What remains is a transformed community that again embraces technology that is now free," the film insinuates, "from co-Jewish control," unquote, and infused instead with German spirituality. So I think that's a pretty fair description of the stereotypes that are involved in all of this, and what might have been in the minds of a lot of contemporary German audiences.
But it sure is funny that the man who's responsible for thinking up the evil plot, he's fine. The people who do the evil plot,
oh yeah,
punish the underlings.
Authoritarianism is very, very important in all of this, so that it's almost like the workers, exist. And in fact, this is part of the issue of the film, is how much, the sculptural use of the masses are totalitarian. This is what Siegfried Krakauer, the anti-Nazi Frankfurt School critic, and who wrote From Caligari to Hitler. This is the big charge he made against this film, and it's true. The way that clouds are massed together and everything, you can talk about them in relationship to Triumph of the Will and stuff like this. This is the beginning of one of the really great sequences, I think, in this film, and something that's very one of the great sequences you could say about voyeurism, because it's where a flashlight becomes used as a kind of weapon. A weapon, you could almost say, as a kind of rape, even.
Yeah. And she's got the candle, he's got the electric light. It's the dichotomy between the ancient traditions that she represents as the religious figure down in the catacombs and the modern technology that he represents.
He represents modern technology, even though he's just as ancient in appearance, and the house he lives in is just as ancient. So it's full of contradictions. I think one of the things that's most ingenious about this sequence, too, is the way that once the flashlight appears, it works as a way of creating iris shots, which is this part of the silent film vocabulary where you black out the rest of the screen. So, you get that, his artificial hand, sort of like eliminating it. And now you've got something that actually makes me think in certain ways of Peeping Tom. Yeah. Very much, too, which is the idea of seeing as a form of aggression.
And being attacked by light, and of course film is recording of light. Comments about the actress here. Bridget Helm was born Ava Schnittenhelm, and she first met Fritz Lang when she was just 17 years old. Did a screen test, and it was about a year later she gets cast as not just the lead in this film, but she gets to play Maria, she gets to play False Maria, she plays the robot, she plays the figure of death that comes to life from the statues of the seven deadly sins. I mean, it is an absolute acting tour de force from a woman who had no prior acting experience.
Absolutely. I mean, I think she's really what it emerges even more in this version, that she's not only the major figure in the whole film, but it's really one of the great performances because of the range. I heard, did you know if it's true that she was a dancer when...
Well, there are different stories that are told about her past. She tells the story that she was just minding her own business, and Lang plucked her out of nowhere and said, "You look fantastic, I love your eyes, I'm going to make you into a movie star," and she was very reluctant. And he tells the story that she was an aspiring actress who had come to him and lobbied for a part. And I think the radical difference between these two stories comes from the fact that she meets him when she's 17 years old. By the time the movie comes out, she's nearing on 20. It's a huge chunk of the formative years of her life that she spent in an incredibly unpleasant environment. I mean, she acquits herself fantastically with this incredible performance, but it wasn't fun. She's covered in bruises every day. She's emotionally terrorized. The crew make fun of her. They call her the Virgin, and that's the nickname that they taunt her with.
Really?
She was just shaking at the end of
I
each
heard
day.
It was particularly tough on her when she gets burnt at the stake at the end because of the actual smoke. And Lang himself threw the torch, apparently, according to Von Harbo. You know, I think it's interesting that to note that the film has a kind of very self-conscious musical structure, because the three parts are actually labeled in musical ways: prelude, intermezzo, and then the third part, furioso. It's so much of what is interesting about Metropolis is how much it relates to the other arts.
It's a very operatic film. It's got that kind of grand scale, not just in the set design, but very operatic emotions going on.
Yes, which was also true, I guess, of Denis Blumkin.
Mm-hmm. This sequence here, as we can see from the title card, is one of the two parts of the film where there is a significant chunk still missing. I don't know entirely what would have been in the footage because it gets confused with what might have been in the book. There's a subplot in the novel about how Fredersen wants to get rid of this Gothic church, that he feels that it is inappropriate for his citizens to continue to worship a god because they should be worshiping the power of the state instead. And it does have that interesting parallel to the totalitarian states that were built by real-life dictators like Hitler and Stalin, where they get rid of the church as a rival power base. And in the novel, Fredersen is reluctant to take them on because it's too big of a political fight, and it's something that he wants to do and doesn't pull across. And the actor who plays the monk was also Fritz Rasp, who plays Slim, so there's some more doubling going on there. But as we can see, the footage is missing from the movie, so it's not entirely clear how it would have all fit in.
Yeah, it's because what we have is still very close, but it's sort of like the parts in the cathedral are. It's funny for a film that has so many religious overtones, but the parts in the cathedral, for me, in some ways, among the murkier parts, actually. It's interesting what you say about the politics. To cite again Thomas L. Sasser's book on Metropolis, he goes into the whole fact that there were not only rather predictable objections to the film by German communists, but also by Nazis, and it's worth kind of citing some of these. For instance, the German communists. One German communist wrote, "This film, born out of bourgeois capitalist ideology and produced with the insistently obtrusive intent to propagate the idea of class reconciliation, to further capitalist methods of exploitation, only succeeds in unmasking the bourgeois, worker-friendly phraseology in all its mendacity. The film is financed with the same capital that has pushed through the recent exploitative labor laws." But then, on the other hand, you have a Nazi critic saying that basically saying that the film manages to turn the tables on the films. I mean, I'm sorry, that it was calling it a Bolshevik film made by Jewish liberals trying to ingratiate themselves with the Americans.
Yeah, when there was that alleged meeting between Fritz Lang and Goebbels, the story as it's told is that Goebbels loved the Nibelungen and hated Metropolis.
Oh, really? I hadn't known that. Because I heard that Hitler liked Metropolis, maybe incorrectly.
When Channing Pollock made his cuts to the American edition, and that was released in the United States in March of 1927, those cuts were then exported back for the German version because the critical response in Germany had been, the movie looks fantastic, but the story's a mess. And so then when Channing Pollock comes in and says, well, the problem is these Germans don't know how to tell a story, so we're going to fix that for them. And then they're actually, the New York Times writes a review of it saying, we think that this new cut is closer to Lang's intention than, it's stunning in its arrogance. But the response from UFA was, well, if we're having critical problems in the German press that people don't like the story, and the Americans have fixed the story, well then let's go ahead and take that back. So they go, but they don't copy all of the Pollock cuts. There was a worry from the German censors that some of the stuff they did in the American version was too communist. So they tried to downplay what they thought was the communist tendencies of the American cut.
Yeah, but it's so funny that it kind of cuts across the whole spectrum, that people of every political persuasion have been criticizing it, and for reverse reasons. And it's certainly true that the argument of Siegfried Krakauer, the author from Caligari to Hitler, is just that it uses, even though it's very pleasing to the eye, the kind of geometric use of crowds and everything is really dehumanizing the characters. And in the same way that in Triumph of the Will, the Nazi propaganda films, supposedly a documentary, but actually staged as an event so that it could be filmed. And in that sense, another thing that could even be seen as a parallel to Metropolis.
But I think some of that comes out of Lang's own psychology, his attitudes towards people, and not necessarily some kind of larger social dehumanization that the burgeoning Nazi state was promoting. Lang was always skeptical of crowds. To him, the people was the same as the mob. And so you see that hatred of mob mentality come through very dominantly in his American films like Fury.
Well, I guess it's also true that you get this idea of crowds turned into lynch mobs in a sense. And you get that even in him, actually, when the gangsters gang up on Peter Lorre.
Yeah.
It's there is some of that. But at the same time, you could also have to say that Lang was a political person later in life.
Yeah.
And this is a pre-political film, I think.
Yeah. But when he worked with Bertolt Brecht on Hangmen Also Die, Brecht got really frustrated because he would see that opportunity as a way of saying, people can band together against the fascists. We can overcome, basically. And Lang kept undercutting that message by saying, the groups of people who were in the concentration camps, they're going to be infighting and they're going to appear stupid. Brecht and Lang really didn't see eye to eye on that because Lang was so skeptical of the idea, not of democracy, but of the idea that people as groups can be trusted. That I think that colored his politics both pre and post political awakening.
That's right. In fact, there's a famous shot that a lot of people criticized about in Fury when he cuts from a crowd of gossiping people to chickens.
Chickens, yeah.
Yeah, and so it already expresses a kind of contempt for people and mass, as masses.
I love this elevator.
Yes, which is also. It's great, but it's also another instance of something that's very old-fashioned.
And also physically implausible. There's no way you could actually build such a thing and have it work in a real building.
This is a very unmodern, apartment, too. It's very funny.
You can just barely make out the Art Deco designs on the wall because of the poor resolution. But it's a beautiful-looking apartment. I'd live there.
Yeah, it is beautiful, but it's funny because it's sort of like you don't get the sense of it. There's a definite, it's about a class thing, too. It's so funny because you could say that I think Gunning writes about this that there's a certain kind of way in which he actually says the clash between Gothic and modern imagery in the film often displaces the more manifest conflict between classes, and I think those things kind of get confused in some ways too, because they're both involved with almost stereotypes, you could say. And the idea of conveying information about who people are very quickly, which means that you have to stereotype them in a certain way.
But it shows you this by losing this.
Yeah.
We lost that sense of what it was Frater was giving up in his deliberate changing of place with the workers underground. He could be hanging out in this apartment, smoking his cigarettes and having a relaxing, leisurely time. He's chosen to put on the overalls and go stand at that clock machine and work a 10-hour shift.
Yeah, this is all true, but he also, as I say it, at least according to the novel, this is just because he has the hots for
Yes.
Maria. It's not out of any kind of social conscience. And it's, of course, the idea of social conscience. I mean, he has a social conscience, you could say, maybe relative to his father and to Rotwang, but that's just because they're totally unscrupulous in terms of spying and conniving and all of this.
Yeah, and I think there is the sense in the movie that his first encounter with Maria in the catacombs, when she first talks about we need a mediator, and then there's that glowing halo of light on the back of his head, it's as if that's his moment of awakening. That you're right, he's made the choice to go into the worker city because he's skirt chasing. And it's then, in his efforts to find Maria, once he finds her, she wakens that Messiah spirit in him.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is that she basically turns him into a little boy, and in other words, even his innocence becomes more pronounced because of her. Even though she's an innocent character, the fact that she, is a nurturing mother figure is sort of like leads in some way to his social consciousness, what little there is of it.
These banknotes that he's bribing him with, some of them still exist and are in a museum in Berlin. And it was interesting for a while because this footage didn't exist, or it wasn't. People didn't know it existed. So they would see these banknotes and they would go, "Well, this is a prop that was made for Metropolis, but it never appears in the movie. So what's it for?" And it's fun to actually see the scene where the banknotes are shown. Black there, indicating that there was even with this restored footage, because basically what they found in Argentina was a more or less complete print, but it did still have damage to sections that couldn't be recovered.
Oh, really? So in other words, because I thought we're missing about 5 minutes
right.
now,
and,
or 7 minutes? I can't remember exactly.
and part of that also reflects that there was nitrate damage to the 35mm element. That when they made that 16mm print in the 1970s, some of the sections of the 35 had already decayed beyond usableness.
Well, it does seem pretty likely that this is as good as we're going to get.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's pretty good. I mean, it seems to me that even the material that's missing doesn't seem to be major material.
But I think another thing was people need to recognize when they're comparing the beautiful picture quality of footage like this with the grainier and grittier quality of the footage that immediately preceded it. With this process, there was a 30-year sequence of time in which people like Patalas, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Patalas, yeah.
And then later Martin Kerper and all of the other people involved in this restoration team were going around the world and finding original elements and master negatives and dupe negatives and lavender prints and all of the different pieces, so that with each scene they could say, here is the best possible copy of this shot, and here's the best possible copy of this shot. With the restored footage, that's all there is. So it's not just that there are fancy special techniques you can do to make old footage look good. That's not why this looked good. This looks good because it's original elements that have been well cared for. So we've got this, we're coming up, of course, on the big transformation sequence. this is one of the most famous moments in the movie. I had seen this sequence before I saw the rest of it. The first time I saw Metropolis, first time I saw any Fritz Lang movie was the Giorgio Moroder Metropolis in 1984. I was familiar with silent film at that time because I was a Buster Keaton fan since I was a little kid. But I was 14 years old, and to be honest, the musical lineup that they had in the Moroder Metropolis, that was what drew me in, and then I was hooked. But being a science fiction fan as well, I had been familiar with there were, reproductions of photographs from the movie that would give you a sense of what to expect. And this scene was just such an integral part of horror cinema.
It's worth. Thomas L. Sasser, in his book on Metropolis, has some interesting things about the difference in editing. Let me just read from, because I think it's kind of very revealing. It says, "This may seem like idle theorizing, but it can also confirm that much of 20s German cinema was based on a visual grammar different from what we have come to accept as the norm, namely Hollywood-type continuity editing. Moroder gives the narrative a unilinear direction via establishing shots, scene dissection, close-up, by the simple expedient of relying on reverse field editing, shot counter-shot, and point-of-view shots to generate continuity, cutting out most of the inserts which in Lang's version had separated in time and in space the characters' looks from their objects. To admirers of Lang, this is an unpardonable interference in the text, for the hallmark of his style is precisely the interpolation of disorienting or disrupting visuals into the classic match-cut sequence, making what is represented seem ambiguously motivated and always happening at one remove." So that's very interesting, because it's sort of like teaching us something about the fact that films do have grammar that we pick up on, even if we don't know that we're doing it. And Moroder was perhaps even unconsciously adapting it to what he knew, but not to what Lang was doing. And so it's important, I think, in understanding Lang, to know that to be aware of that difference.
There's another even subtler difference in editorial technique between different copies of the film that is much harder to see. You'd have to sit and do side-by-side frame grabs to figure it out. But one of the ways in which you could have good-looking prints for a film that was going to be distributed around the world, because it was very difficult to make good quality dupe negatives back then. They were very contrasty. So if you knew you were selling to a global audience, one of the things you do is you just shoot the scene either from two cameras sitting side by side, or you do multiple takes, and you would assemble different negatives from slightly different footage. So there are different prints where the scene, if you are just looking at it as a viewer, it's going to look the same. But if you sit and do the individual frame grabs, you're going to see it's a slightly different take. Or there's the second one of the tracking shots.
Oh yeah,
it's number two. The third one.
Almost looks like a zoom the way it's done.
And that was actually Froelich. Gustav Froelich is running towards it on the ground, and the camera is next to him on a trolley. But so there are those tiny little differences. So the restoration team is having to make a choice of which shot they're going to consider to be the definitive version of any given shot, and sometimes those are controversial decisions.
Yeah, sure. Because there are other cases where, for example, in Foolish Wives, we have a version that was sent out to Italy before it opened in America, and has different takes of certain sequences. And this has happened with other films over the years, particularly.
It's a big thing with Charlie Chaplin, because he was almost always working with two cameras side by side, the A camera and the B camera.
Yes.
Well, got to say something about the robot here, because the robot is about to disappear from the movie, and so this is my last chance to say it. The original plan, the guy who built it was Walter Schultz, and his original idea was to actually have real copper plates hammered around like a suit of armor that she was going to wear. And for obvious reasons, this proved to be incredibly difficult to do and expensive, and so complications interfered, and they received, by mistake, a trade shipment of samples of this stuff called plastic wood, which was a substance with the consistency of clay that, when hardened, had the texture and strength of wood. So what they did was they took ordinary kitchen rolling pins and rolled out this plastic wood stuff and cut out sheets of it as if it were copper plates, and then they molded them onto Bridget Helm's body and let them dry, and then they polished it with this silver varnish and made the suit.
That's another thing that must have made it really hard
yeah,
for her,
it took
I would
weeks.
think.
It took weeks that she's standing there as they're building the suit on top of her. And they built it with the expectation that this transformation scene, she was going to be standing up. And then they come to the set on the day, and Lang says she should sit down in the chair. Well, the suit wasn't designed to sit down in, so that's cutting into her legs and very tender parts of her body, very painfully. And it was very difficult at that point to adapt because it had been hardened and polished. There wasn't a lot they could do. So this was a physically incredibly painful process for her.
This makes me think of Frankenstein a lot, actually.
Yes. It's a clear antecedent.
Yeah.
It's not just an antecedent to Frankenstein the movie, but it's also drawing from Frankenstein as a novel. And there are other texts that are playing into this. I think the Golem would be one that people are often going to cite. That was the 1920 film by Paul Wegener. But there's another story as well that's really significant in this case, and that's the story of Al-Rauni. And I know the first time I told you this, I ought to spell it because it's hard to figure out my pronunciation. Alraune. It's the German word for mandrake. And the ancient folk legend of the mandrake was that it would grow underneath gallows, and so when men were hanged, they would ejaculate, and that would be absorbed by the mandrake root, and then a witch would use it to impregnate herself, and the child she would give birth to would look human, but would be soulless. And in 1911, there was a book, Al-Rauni, that was published that took that folk legend and kind of updated it for the Frankenstein times, where there's a mad scientist, and he uses the semen of a hanged man to impregnate a prostitute. And then he raises the child as his own child, but she comes to realize that she is in fact not of ordinary birth and goes on a murderous rampage. It's a story that has fallen out of any contemporary relevance because there are plenty of people who are conceived by artificial insemination. They're not soulless monsters, yes. So it doesn't really mean anything anymore. But it was, there were a number of film adaptations in the early part of the 20th century. There were two in 1918, one of them by the guy who then immigrated to the U.S. and changed his name to Michael Curtiz. The other one was an Austrian production that did get released in the U.S. under the title Sacrifice. Then, in 1928, it was remade yet again with Bridget Helm as Al-Rauni, because she had so distinguished herself in this role in Metropolis. She kind of gets typecast. And it gets remade a fourth time in 1930 as a talkie, and once again, it's Bridget Helm as Al-Rauni.
No kidding. Well, one of the things that I'm really struck by, though, is that when she wound up playing roles in the immediate aftermath of Metropolis, what impressed other directors, it seems like the most, or at least Rosa von Sternberg and Marcel L'Herbier, was the false Maria, not the other Maria, not the sweet, innocent, virginal Maria, but the evil Maria. Because I don't know how many people might know this, but that Joseph von Sternberg's original choice for the lead in The Blue Angel was Bridget Helm, and he only turned to Marlene Dietrich after Helm turned it down for some reason. I don't know why she turned it down. And then in L'Argent, this big French super production, but which, by the way, also stars Alfred Abel in a role as a industrialist. She plays herself a very evil industrialist. And in both cases, it's almost like she became known, in those two at least films certainly, for playing kind of dominatrix roles. And so it's interesting that that's what caught on, not the sweet version, the wink, the winking Maria.
That is a famous image too from the film. For those of you who might be wondering why you haven't seen much more of Bridget Helm, in the early 1930s she married the CEO of BMW and settled down to life as a housefrau.
Oh, this is very important, by the way. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's all.
This is like the primal scene where the film goes absolutely bananas. And this is even, some of these things are only appearing on screen for 1 second.
Yeah.
There are scratches in the emulsion, which make it like an avant-garde film by Stan Brakhage. You know, it's like, it's in a way, it's the most remarkable sequence in the whole film. When he thinks he sees his parents having sex, basically.
Yeah.
That's what it seems like. That's what gives it the whole kind of of Freudian meaning, which gives him a nervous breakdown. In the novel, he actually tries to strangle his father when he comes upon this scene, not knowing that supposedly that it's his father. But that makes it even more of a kind of like Oedipal confrontation.
And of course, it was a key component of Expressionist cinema, that focus on dreams and visions. Fritz Lang's movies are full of these visionary moments where it can otherwise be a completely realistic story. This even happens in the Hollywood years, a totally normal story, and then there's some kind of crazy vision that comes into it.
It's also, though, very much a tradition of German Romanticism that you have a kind of like fairly wimpy hero who's tender-hearted. And
it's also Gothic storytelling. The hero gets sick and is out of the action for a while. In terms of Expressionist cinema, what's interesting is that Expressionism as an art movement was dead in all other media before it shows up in films. It starts to show up as an art movement in Germany around 1910. And it's kind of like the juncture between Fauvism and Surrealism. It was all about bold colors and almost cubist architectural structures, visions that were drawn from dreams, and it was a paradoxically optimistic movement because the Expressionists believed that if they could get through the horror, the world could be remade by revolution. So World War I comes along, and the Expressionists go, "Hey, here comes our apocalypse," and then it turns out to be just horror for its own sake, not any kind of better world. Well, and that killed it off.
Yeah, it's worth also saying though that Lang himself was in complete denial about. He said, "I don't even know what an Expressionist film is."
Yeah, he rejected the idea.
And so and there has been a lot of confusion about it. I mean, it's partly, I think the main influential text was in a way The Haunted Scream by Buddy Eisner, but she unfortunately started. I think she and the two people. There were many people who were responsible for getting the idea that everything bad in the film is attributable to Leah von Harbo.
Yeah,
but she was one of them because she liked. Yeah, she liked Lang, was a friend of his, and he kept contradicting her and saying, "No, you can't blame it all on my ex-wife." But also, Louis Buñuel reviewed Metropolis in a Madrid newspaper, and he basically said everything in this film that's poetic and good is Fritz Lang, and everything that's ridiculous is. So there's a kind of misogyny that enters into a lot of these arguments, and it is complicated because obviously Fritz Lang is now considered a great artist, whereas Thea von Harbo by and large is considered a kind of a hack.
Yeah.
But she was a very important best-selling author in that period. And I guess there was a lot of things associated. Apparently, there was a pigskin-bound edition of the novel that was sort of like presented to, select people at the time of the premiere of this film and things like this. And this is true of the other films that she worked on. But anyway, this is very interesting montage where you're getting this kind of association of his delirium with this kind of sexual delirium, which is very different from anything else I can think of in Lang films. It's much more the idea of licentiousness and everything.
It's also a fascinatingly irrational idea. So we've got this robot, we've made it look like this union organizer, and we want to send it down to disrupt the workers, so let's make sure that it's convincing. What do? Let's have it do a strip show.
That's right. And of course, this den of iniquity, which is Yoshiwara. Which is,
how is that a prep for what its essential assignment is supposed to be?
And obviously he's very upset, but he doesn't even know it's happening. So it's very peculiar, the way but it's almost like emotional aspects that are causing the montage, rather than, it's almost like dreamlike connections. Yeah. That's why I think we can argue on behalf of the whole Freudian reading of this film, rather than seeing it in political terms. According to the film critic Stuart Collins in his very entertaining book Film Follies, The False Maria is a kind of parody of Germany's New Woman. You might even say, and this is my idea, not Stuart's, that she figures in Metropolis a little bit like the way that Faye Dunaway's character in Network is Paddy Chayefsky's crazed and horrified vision of America's New Woman in 1976, almost exactly half a century after Metropolis.
This is an amazing set. We got more hand imagery here.
Yeah. That's like the mob rushing up the steps in Tower of Babel, and of course the sexual release again.
And it is my understanding that that is Bridget Helm inside that costume there.
Yeah. And it's, yeah, this irrational thing, because, I mean, it's like he's not seeing any of this, but he's obviously acting as if he's seeing it all. It's a kind of dreamlike associations that ties up with his nervous breakdown, too, in terms of all these. Because you even get a flash forward of death during that when he runs into the false Maria and his father embracing. Very strange.
Well, we're beginning the third part of the film, Furioso, and one of the things that I find fascinating about this is how this part kind of plays like the recap at the beginning of the next episode of a chapter serial. It's like, well, here's the story so far, and they kind of retread a lot of story ground in the opening part of this section. The first serial that was made in Germany was in 1917, and it was called Homunculus, and it was another story about a mad scientist who builds an artificial being, and it doesn't have a soul, and it becomes aware of its soulless characteristics and declares war on mankind and blah, blah, blah. And it was spread over 3 parts. The distribution of serials in Germany was very difficult because as they started to become popular in the rest of the world, they were really taking off in France and in the United States. There was a lot of advantages to them because you could invest in your cast and crew and you'd build your sets, and you'd only have to do that investment once, and then you'd get to make like 12 sales off of it. And if you promoted the first part of the chapter successfully, then the cliffhanger itself would be the promotion for people to come back. So it was a very efficient business model in the rest of the world, but in Germany the distribution system was such that it wasn't possible to guarantee a particular release date. So it was very, very hard to make sure that the episodes of a serial were shown in sequence. Obviously, if you didn't see them in sequence, it's a huge problem. Yeah. And German audiences just didn't adapt to the idea of going to the movies as a regular weekly or bi-weekly event the way they did in other countries. So they were missing episodes, and it just wasn't clicking.
This is even though some people were reading the novel of Metropolis as a serial in the newspaper.
Right. So they're used to it in other media, but in terms of going to the theaters with some frequency. So the compromise that was struck was that when serials first started coming to Germany, what they would do would be edit the episodes together into longer chunks. So if you've got a 12-chapter serial, you'd sell it it'd be 3 parts, 3 really big parts. And meanwhile, for regular films that were domestically made in Germany, the selling point that distributors would use when they were trying to make bookings at the exhibitors, there were 3 things that were markers of prestige: the cast, the budget, and the length. So little by little, audiences were being trained to associate length with quality and to get used to really long movies. And when Fritz Lang first starts making films, he's getting started with serials. Spiders, Dr. Mabuse, the Nibelungen. He's well into the German version of serial filmmaking, where they're giant movies. Yes. It's only 2 or so parts, but they're huge films. In a way, you could see Metropolis as like he's finally starting to scale it back a bit. From our standpoint, we look at it as 150 minutes, but it's only one 150-minute film.
So you see the 3-part structure of this is related to that.
Yeah, it's like a serial in one.
No, that's very interesting, and it also does explain because Mabuse and Nibelungen each in 2 parts, right? Or
yes, yeah.
Well, it does have, the kind of cross-cutting principle is so basic to serial kind of action, At least I always think of it that way, that it involves some, it's like the idea of you get an intolerance too. I mean, basically all these actions going on at the same time, or at least a feeling of simultaneity. And of course, the advantage of this longer version is that all of these plot strands are clarified, basically. Well, we see the connective tissue a lot more clearly.
You were talking before about the idea of extended versions and director's cuts as a sort of modern fetish.
Yeah. Right, and it seems to me that there is a kind of, what you could call a footage fetishism, which makes the argument that the more footage, the better, which is, of course, the way people who put out DVDs and so on like to sell the same product twice or 3 times or 4 times, but it doesn't always make the film better. And I think even though in some ways it makes this film better, it also makes it a little not necessarily better in every instance.
And the thing that worries me is that, you and I are here because we love Metropolis. And Masters of Cinema asked us to do this because they love Metropolis. And the people who are going to buy this on Blu-ray, they're doing it because they love Metropolis. And yet all of us are coming to this added footage fresh. We've never seen it before. I mean, you and I saw it for the first time recently.
Yeah.
And many of the people involved in the production of the Blu-ray hadn't seen it as of the time that the process was going forward. In other words, that you can love this movie passionately and intensely, and it can be this urgent pop cultural document into the 21st century without the footage.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing that it's being restored, but we can't pretend that the changes that were made to the movie really injured it that much, because obviously in its transformed state, it still works.
Right, so it's not at all the same. Of course, when people talk about the complete Greed or the complete Magnificent Ambersons, they don't even know what they mean, because there was no single version you can point to. They're different, longer versions and so on, but it's very hard to pinpoint one definitive version ever. How would you, because people aren't even clear what they mean by definitive.
And in a way, this process is trying to create a definitive version where there hadn't been one before, because it had been the case that everybody was seeing a different version of Metropolis, and it was, in a way, it was like a holy text in a dead language, where in order to access it, you're doing it through an intermediary, and the question is, well, which translation are you reading? Well, which version of Metropolis did you see? I saw the Moroder version. Oh, well, I saw the Australian cut. And the copyright holders who have been financing this restoration project have been systematic in pushing those alternate cuts out of the marketplace, such that they're trying to make sure that if you see Metropolis, there's one Metropolis, and this is it. And those transformed versions that made us into fans in the first place are disappearing, and there's something about that I find worrisome.
Well, right. In a way, it's better to have all of them available. And, there's a certain kind of way in which collectors like to do that. It's, I'm reminded of, in Del Sasser's book, he quotes Walter Benjamin at one point, his description of a true collector in his essay Unpacking My Library. And this is as someone to whom ownership, if the most intimate relationship is the most intimate relationship that one can have to objects. Not that they come alive in him, it is he who lives in them. And I think that's, a lot of the ways, when the edition of the novel that I got, that's probably the best of current ones, is introduced by Forrest J. Ackerman, one of the great collectors of all time. And so Metropolis is a whole group of objects in the same way that, now, and even at the time it came out, there were some spin-offs, in terms of the novel, in terms of other related things. And of course, and it continues to be, there's so many other objects, books about it, things like this.
And the funny thing is
industry.
That so many of those books are, a lot of Metropolis scholarship has been focused on discussing the lost footage.
Yeah.
Because it was lost, and that was what made it interesting. And now that it's been put back into place, it no longer deserves that kind of privileged attention, because it's subplots and it's connective tissue. It's not the thrust of the movie, which was always, the thrust of the movie was always there.
I have to say, by the way, sorry to interrupt you, just something about what's going on now. I've always found one of the things that I found hard to take in all of this is the real contempt, so much contempt for the workers that they're willing to turn on a dime from, seeing her angelic side, and now they're going for her destroying the city. It's like they don't know anything. They're willing to go along with anything that anybody says.
Well, an interesting parallel in this scene is to the pre-code film by William Wellman, Heroes for Sale, which similarly has a hero who's trying to stop a workers' riot. The workers are going to go in and destroy the machines that have replaced their work, and he recognizes, this is only going to hurt you. That's not the way you want to make your case. He tries to stop the riot, ends up being attacked both by his fellow workers and then also by the state, and it all goes wrong for him. Very much the same sort of thing that's happening with Frater right now.
Right, and it's one of the only things that makes Frater like less than a total wimp is the fact that he could tell that she's a false Maria. Nobody else seems to be. That's the thing, is how can nobody in the crowd can tell that it's not, it's like there's something kind of weird going on. This, like Madonna who turns into a whore suddenly. I mean, it's like...
there were so many worker riots in the early part of the 20th century that followed this kind of trajectory. There was, in 1910, the bombing of the Los Angeles Daily Times office by anarchists. But the lead investigators in the case, and it took them months to pierce this thing, for the longest time seriously believed, and this was their operating theory of the case, that the owners of the newspaper had bombed their own building as an excuse to fight even harder against unionization. So the unions versus bosses battles for audiences at this time, that they would turn this ugly, that was newspaper headlines, that was the world they lived in.
Well, there's a very comic book notion to this idea of revolution, which is why, by the way, you get the Marseillaise in part of the score.
Yeah.
It's a completely comic book version of the idea of the workers' revolution.
Here's the other main missing scene, the other footage that wasn't recovered for this edition, that would have involved with Maria escaping from Rotveng's house. And I find it a shame that footage is missing, especially because it would have been the last meaningful confrontation between Rotveng and Fredersen before the finale. And since there is that ambiguity about what it is that Fredersen really thought was going to happen, and how did Rotveng expect his revenge to play out, I would have been fascinated to see whether or not that footage helped resolve that question, or if it would have remained ambiguous. Because at the end, when the riot happens and the lights go out, Fredersen seems happy. The only time he gets upset is when he gets word, "Oh, your son was down there." But that can't have been Rotveng's intended revenge, because Rotveng had nothing to do with Fredersen.
Yeah. It's aspect. It does get... This is such a strange shot where you get
the bolt of light coming out the door.
Yeah. And the skyscrapers behind this ancient cottage.
So that thing in the middle there,
it's
the
like a
bell,
dog, yeah,
it is based on the Gropius Monument, which was built by one of the Bauhaus founders. His name was Walter Gropius. That's why it's the Gropius Monument, and it was built around 1920 to 1922 as a monument to memorialize the workers killed in the Kapp Putsch. So its presence here, its specific look, is designed to be that political statement, to make that connection with the audience that this is a political monument about the death of workers.
Yeah, it's something very exciting about the way crowds are manipulated in this sequence. In a way, that's throughout this film. It seems to me the way that they're used, just because in a way he had the means and budget to do it.
Yeah.
It's pretty remarkable. Even if it depends on their facelessness. And notice that even now, they're still, the women in this movie are few and far between.
Yeah.
You start seeing women workers very, very late in the proceedings.
I'd always taken it that the women were just staying back at the apartments, and that they're drawn out as their menfolk are
I guess so,
fighting back. But I know that that's not how it's often been written about, so maybe I'm just reading it wrong.
Well, there's a woman there.
Yeah.
But, you're starting to see them.
Yeah.
But I just mean that it's early on you don't see them, so it's almost like an afterthought, that they start turning up.
And the thunderous energy with which they move, compared to the zombie-like staccato movements that they went down the same hallway at the beginning, is a stark contrast. That when they're working, they're practically dead. They now seem alive only because they're being provoked into this act of violence.
Yeah, it's funny, although this is devolving completely into an action film, and I think we're no longer the people watching it at any time are concerned with to what extent this is a view of the future.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's nonetheless interesting, in spite of all the ways in which it's not a vision of the future, that it relates more today to current events than 2001 does.
Mm-hmm.
which of course depended on the assumption of the perpetuation of the Cold War for much of it, so the
Right.
plot and the original parts and so on. That this is actually has in some ways well, you can't say it's dated less, but it seems to me that it's more. In some ways, it has, at least as far as what concerns are.
Yeah, people are still being displaced by technology. Unemployment is still a force that can lead people to extreme acts.
Look at all those numbers that are.
Yeah.
It's so, this is not supposed to be a prison, but it's obviously made into one graphically, which is kind of funny. And so it's, in terms of breaking through, it's, reminds me in a funny sort of way. I'm told that, in terms of all the things that influenced, which are in the avant-garde as well as in the mainstream, there was, the Living Theater did a production of something called Frankenstein, which had stagings of things that were very much like this sort of setup here. And in Phil Glass and Robert Wilson's avant-garde theater piece, Einstein on the Beach, there's a direct reference to the machine room explosion in this film, which is, about to take place.
Yeah. We should probably mention something about the Shuftan process, which was first used in this film. It had been pioneered for use earlier, but this is the first time it actually ended up being used. And it was invented by Eugen Shuftan, who was also a cinematographer. And the idea was, it's very similar to what would now be done with matte paintings, where you would, with a matte painting, you have a piece of glass and you paint part of the set onto the glass and you photograph through the glass onto the set. The problem with that is that it's really difficult to paint an effective-looking set onto the glass and have it be convincing as the set. So in some ways, the Shuftan process was superior in that you'd build a model set, and it would be three-dimensional. And then you would have a mirror that would reflect that model set, and you would just scrape part of the reflective nature of the mirror off part of the mirror, so you'd have real actors on a real set as a reflection on one part, seen through the glass.
Yes.
And then the model is the reflection on the rest of the glass. Lang says that technique was only used in the machine room for the giant machine. And Shuftan says, well, we used it for the workers' barracks as well. Looking at the footage as it appears in the movie, I think it's pretty obvious it was used on the workers' barracks. It looks like a model to me. But I just wanted to mention that dispute there.
This surveillance imagery is really fascinating. Of course, you get versions of this even earlier in
The
Louis
Spiders.
Fiat serials, too.
Yeah, you did it in the
and
Spiders,
of course
yeah.
in the Spiders.
Yeah.
But you also get it in things like Le Vampire, I think. And,
Yeah.
and so on. I love that ticker tape machine too. You get in this office.
And again, so he's clearly provoking the very things that happen. Fredersen has every expectation this is where this is going to go.
Well, it seems to me that, again, it's part of the Freudian interpretation of this film. The moment he has his nervous breakdown, the whole movie goes bananas, and it never recovers from that. In a certain
the moment that Frater has his nervous breakdown?
That's right, when the son does. It's like the film is everything almost that happens from there to the end of the film, including the last scene, is totally illogical and makes no sense.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's a kind of a freewheeling fantasy, which is almost like built on irrational but emotional associations of one thing with another, but not with something that you can sort of make sense in terms of psychology or motivations. Or it's very odd that way. It's almost like that they planned that this was going to happen, but they got so, basically consumed with other details that didn't become as important. The actual sort of like justifying it in terms of plot.
In the Marauder version, the story is told that they simply want the robot to discredit Maria and to break up the unionizing that she's doing down there. And that once they let her loose, it's her on her own that provokes the riot. So all of the footage in which we see Fredersen either initially saying, I want the riot to happen, or otherwise seeming complicit, all of that is removed from the Marauder version. And I connect that to the idea that in Reagan America, having the capitalist destroy his own factory and kill his own workers for his own selfish reasons would have been a little bit much to sell to
Well,
audiences.
this movie definitely is predicated on a totally elitist view of the society, completely. I mean, it's like, only somebody like the hero is allowed to have these feelings. The other people don't. They're all this faceless mob, and it's like there's all kinds of taken for granted ideas about, which again makes me think in a certain way of the universe of Ayn Rand, sort of, it's like superstars and groundlings and nothing in between, basically. Which is like no middle management either, too. I mean,
I want to say something about that staircase, because
Yes.
the one that she just ran up, a trivial little moment, tiny little thing, but it produced a major fight between Lang and Junta, because what had happened was they were running low on money at this point. It was kind of late in the production, and the UFA bosses had come to Junta and said, "Can you just scale this back, spend a little bit less money on this, because it's a tiny little piece." And he goes, "Okay, fine," and redoes the design. They build the set that way. Lang arrives on the set for the shoot and explodes because apparently nobody bothered to tell him. And everybody, Junta and everybody had just assumed that Lang was okay with this, but he shows up and says, "There's no way that I am going to film anything on sets that weren't what I signed off on during the planning meetings."
Instantly, I'd sorry to interrupt, but I'd just say
Yeah.
one thing that's very interesting about the kind of lighting and all this is how much it echoes the production of the False Maria in the lab.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there are a lot of interesting echoes in the sequence. Like when the water gushes out, it's like the wounding of the dragon and the Nibelungen. Actually, it's almost like literally. You'll see later on, almost a duplication of the same image.
And it was very complicated special effects because those are in-camera shots. That they shoot
really?
the background plate and then they wind it back and then they shoot the electrical footage on top of it. And tiny mistake, and they have to do it all over again.
Well, this is, of course, part of the basic idea of these, super spectaculars, is that you build all these wonderful sets. This is where it's like the wounding of the dragon. And then you destroy them all.
Yeah.
It's sort of like... you get the apotheosis of that in Spielberg's 1941,
It took
the pleasure of destroying your own sets.
I know. They had 4 reservoirs with 1,600 cubic meter capacity to build up the water pressure to do those. That's the other parts in the scenes here to build up this water pressure. But just to finish the previous story, so Lang and Junta, I mean, they were at loggerheads, but neither of them had anything to argue for. They were just fighting for the sake of fighting. They didn't talk for months. In the end, Lang shot the scene on the staircase, because what else was he going to do? But it was that kind of pointless bickering that's what led to the line about between Lang and Junta and Kettlebell must mediate.
Well, this is almost the only time you get real physical exertion on the part of a woman character. It's sort of like she suddenly becomes, labor.
So with these kids, because I think I mentioned before that Thea von Harbu actually she would make cocoa and soup to feed the people on the set, and they needed to because this is being shot in the fall, so this water is not heated, and so they're wandering around in basically just freezing water all day long for these incredibly long days. People get real cold. She was doing her best to keep them happy, bring them hot food. So the word spreads out, free food, and then they're also giving toys to the kids to keep them happy. And every day they would come in to shoot, because it took 2 weeks to do these scenes. Every day there were more kids than the day before, because the word was spreading, free food, free toys.
Yeah, it sounds like some of the kind of production anecdotes you hear about the 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, when you have all these little boys getting sick and throwing up at the same time, and things like this.
See, I look at the top of those that looks like a shift dancing to me.
Yeah. Well, whenever you have these things in interviews, there's always very approximate memories, because it's like often they're talking about them decades later.
Yeah.
And you say the same things over and over to interviewers until you believe them yourself. I mean, Lang was not always known for, telling the truth. He created some real whoppers, including the story of how he left Germany, because they discovered from his, his passport that it wasn't accurate. So this is quite an interesting shot.
It's interesting to see some of these restored pieces in the middle of this, because for the most part, this latter part of the movie is relatively intact across the different cuts. There wasn't a lot of material here that was deleted either by Pollack or was missing from the Moroder version. And I think that's because, as you said, this is straightforward action movie stuff. It's very accessible, it's very international. Everybody's going to want to see this.
This is so weird, when you have these people. It's again for almost graphic reasons that they're all holding hands and dancing. It doesn't seem to make any sense in the other way exactly. Just like this is makes me think of a jukebox, it's like, it's just like the city's going haywire, the same way the movie is going haywire. This is very Blade Runner, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And it's also interesting that, once again, H.G. Wells was complaining about how he thought this was not an accurate vision of the future, and yet here we are. We're in the outskirts of Chicago recording this in 2010, and that looks a lot like Chicago, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's so clear that H.G. Wells just really felt was envious and felt ripped off, and and that's really what's under. And also, he just doesn't get what the film is doing artistically,
right.
Which I think is really, in fact, very few people did. I think to the credit of, even though she thought it was a hoot, Pauline Kael was very appreciative, when she wrote about this film, talking about it as a hoot, and in terms of a kind of monstrosity. It's and it is one of cinema's great monstrosities. This film, this brings me back in a way to an argument made by Hans Schmidt, who I've been quoting before. This friend of mine, he says, in my opinion, postmodern irony is also the clue to that heart and hand business. Overblown characters say overblown things, which are just that, overblown. If you take that too seriously, it's your own choice. The same applies to Nibelungen. It says the film is given to the German people. Then you get a bunch of unpleasant characters who kill each other off for unpleasant reasons, he says. Gangsters really, even if they fight with swords. And here, I think he's basically saying that I don't know if I would go as far as he would in sort of like saying that it's ironic. But he says that he thinks the ending is phony in the same way that the ending of Psycho is phony. That nobody really believes, the psychiatrist is there to wrap it up, but really nobody cares and nobody believes what he's saying. It's just sort of like a putative type of thing, like for a way of sort of closing it off. But it's not really something that necessarily Lang and Harbaugh themselves believed in so much.
Well, not to tread on your territory, but I think that's something that Tom Gunning was writing about in his book, where he described this as a postmodern film in that it's got so many different moods that are clashing together, and that when it was first seen, people focused too much on those mood clashes and said, well, these are the faults of the film. And then 80 years later, audiences are finding those mood clashes and saying, well, this is what makes it great.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of like the way history always works. People's taste changes, what's considered permissible, what's considered funny or not funny. All of this changes over time. But it's very interesting that that the reputation of Metropolis has really grown from being very negative at the beginning to being more and more. Of course, people got oversold on it back in the 20s. There was so much press about it that people kind of felt like they already were bored with it before it opened. There was
it's the backlash against any overhyped blockbuster, definitely.
Yeah.
But I
that
think
happened with Titanic too, in a way.
I think in many ways what you're talking about it being appreciated now differently than before is because of that. The power of its iconography ultimately wins out over these different versions, that over the years people have been exposed to different aspects of the story, and they kind of all blend together such that it doesn't really matter anymore. And that's, I guess, part of the subtext of why I said I was uneasy about the effort to create a definitive version of Metropolis, because I kind of think that it shouldn't ever have a definitive version. There's something precious about the fact that those alterations stand between us and it. It meant that Metropolis was always something a little bit inaccessible.
Well,
we were always aspirants to it.
You're describing it in a way a cult film. And in a way, that's what it's been for so many years. Partly what paved the way for that, too, is how influential it was on other things. Things like, such a wide variety. Madonna's music video, Express Yourself, Pink Floyd, The Wall. Think of lots of other sci-fi movies like the Batman movies,
Absolutely.
Brazil, the Terminator films. Seven, Dark City, The Fifth Element.
It had
I mean,
influence
goes
right
on
away.
and
I mean,
on.
you see William Cameron Menzies' designs in Things to Come, I think, have a lot in common
Yeah,
with
and
this.
even, in fact, one thing I haven't mentioned yet is the very first film in the French New Wave that quoted from another film, quoted this. Jacques Brevet's Paris Belongs to Us, released in 1960, has a direct citation of the Tower of Babel sequence in a 16 mm print that's being shown in somebody's living room. And there it relates to the kind of paranoia of the characters and the kind of milieu, the whole ideas about conspiracy and everything, and even, you could say, metaphysics that circulate in contemporary Paris. And then, of course, there's, I haven't even talked about the amount of impact this has had on writing and fiction. There's both Gravity's Rainbow, which is full of references, but there's a wonderful novel by Howard Rodman, which actually Thomas Pynchon gave a quote blurb to, which is about Fritz Lang when he left Germany, actually, called Destiny Express, which is really full of things about this period, and Theobald Harbaugh is a character also, and so on.
You mentioned 2001, and there's a potentially apocryphal anecdote. I don't have the source for this, so that's why I say it's apocryphal. But from what I heard, Arthur C. Clarke had said something about 2001 being set in 2001 to make it the year after Metropolis. And then somebody asked Fritz Lang about this, and his response was, well, I didn't realize we put a date on Metropolis. So I don't know whether either parts of that story are true.
Well, I've heard other versions that say, and I don't know on what basis, that maybe in some version of the novel, she had actually set a date of 100 years in the future. But I think it's actually Gunning who says that. But if that were true in one of the versions, that would only prove that it wasn't like predicting the future so much. It's just creating an arbitrary
generic,
date 100 years from now, to just because
Yeah.
But again, maybe that's where it might be that might have been in the newspaper serial version, but not
now,
in
you
the
and I have both
version.
read the book in its English translation, and there's no such line in the English translation.
No, but there are different versions of that.
Yeah, I tried to get
translation.
the German original to compare the text, and wasn't able to do so.
But the epigraph that I quoted before is not in most of the English editions. So
there's our third tracking shot.
Oh, yeah.
Every one of them is about a climactic moment for our running hero here. Some moment that shocks him into the next stage.
It's the way it seems to me that a big difference between Fritz Lang and Renault is that Renault, particularly in the 20s, became associated so much with camera movement.
Yeah.
And Fritz Lang, it was all about editing.
Yeah.
Although, of course, it isn't always true. And Renault, editing is important, and Renault's not.
Well, Lang was also very keen on the whole mise en scène of a shot, that the set design and the camera placement, the composition, and where the actors are positioned, that all of that is together part of what makes the shot work. And therefore, it makes it kind of hard to introduce camera movement into that. You have to be real careful about where you do it because it interferes with the composition.
Yeah, sure. But it's interesting because it goes back to that whole idea that you don't have simple point of view shots in Lang. Even though when you do, there are other shots that intervene that make it ambiguous.
Yeah.
So it's not the way that Hitchcock would do it, where you're just suddenly locked into somebody's viewpoint unambiguously. So this is really a kind of Walpurgis knot, I guess, or something.
To me, I think there's a continuity error here. Fredersen's hair looks too gray at this moment, because there's that big moment at the end when he puts his hands up on his head and he believes his son is dead, and when he removes his hands, he has been transformed and his hair is white, and now he's been through sin and come out the other side and it is redeemed, but his hair looks white there, so I think that's a little bit of a mistake.
Yeah, interesting.
Because it is that question of why does Fredersen get redeemed at the end for the calamity that he sets in motion, and in the book he early on posits this thesis that suffering is the consequence of sin. If you are suffering, it's because you did something wrong.
Yeah.
And that he is above all of that because he's the creator of the city.
Except not in his opinion of his mother, who actually hasn't forgiven him.
Right, but in his opinion, he believes that he's above all of that. And in the book, when he gives his instructions to Rotvang to make the robot look like Maria and do all of this, Rotvang tells him directly, "You do realize what this is going to do to your son." And he says, we're going to have to accept that. He's going to have to suffer. So at the end of the movie, it's as if what happens in the movie is the culmination of what was happening in the book, although we don't get the pretext for it in the movie, that he's now experienced the suffering that he thought he would never undergo.
Well, I think you get these contradictions precisely because of what we're talking about as the postmodernist.
Yeah.
It's like you get something more and more overload, and eventually it explodes. The same way that like the water explodes and everything. And in a sense, the movie,
you can see how cold it is. Their breath is coming out.
Yeah. The movie goes into some kind of version of free fall, and like this is even more of it, more hysteria, at the Yashiwa, and it's sort of like, but it's not even logically connected to the other hysteria, except that it's almost like answering some pattern in the minds of Long and Harbaugh, but not in
She's
relationship
caused a riot, so
to
where are you going to go next? I'm going to party.
And this, very end of the world apocalypse type of idea.
We're coming up on an example of one of those editorial transformations that the added footage diminishes in a way. First time we sat down to talk about this, I had singled out the moment when the false Maria and the real Maria cross paths as what I thought was an exceedingly daring editorial choice on Lang's part, that they're both dressed the same, and when they cross paths, we can understand that one of them has exchanged places with the other. But we aren't shown it explicitly. But it turns out we are actually shown it explicitly. The footage was just missing from other prints, so kind of takes a little bit of the fun out for me.
Yeah, it does, but it's, that's the thing about variations of prints. There are so many. You can't make one cut in any film without changing the meaning of everything else in the film, actually, even though we don't always realize this. But the one time I had, worked with this on Touch of Evil, the new version, I discovered that you can't change anything without changing everything. That's what's so interesting about editing.
And that's one of the things that I respect about this decision that they've made to put the little black slugs to indicate, even where there are tiny pieces missing, it's just this acknowledgement all along that this is an approximation of the final cut. They could have made it a little bit easier to watch and take those black slugs out. Maybe even delete the title cards to describe the missing scenes. The story kind of makes sense without them, but
they kept them in.
But it shows a great respect for the source material that they're there.
Yeah, because one of the things that's confused about restoration is you always have to restore something to a particular time and think you can't. The idea that there's some kind of pure final state that you bring it back to is usually a fiction with every film, because the films go through so many changes. And of course, what we're talking about the restoration to in this case was a film that showed only one time, publicly. So this is really like a New Year's Eve celebration, isn't it? Or something like that.
She has a magnetic power to get people to chase along after her. You gotta give her that.
Yeah. Nightclubbers as well as workers. She cuts across it all. These huge doorways are really something.
You get giant doorways again later in Lang.
Like in actually Orson Welles' The Trial, you get doors like that.
Yeah, but what was the film? It's Secret Beyond the Door, where the doors were actually made larger to scale than they were supposed to be, so it would make the characters look slightly smaller.
Yeah, that's another very Freudian Fritz Lang film, actually. One of the most explicitly Freudian.
He gave an interview around the time this movie was made about, because he was fascinated with psychiatry and psychoanalysis, about how that kind of the dream images that come out in psychoanalysis and the way that gives you insight into the interior workings of your mind, that you want to portray that in film involves depicting visions. So that kind of dreamlike quality in the movies is what he sees as being psychologically honest to the characters.
Yeah. It's so interesting here that when she's being called a witch and everything, it's another way of reverting to the Middle Ages, because burning her at the stake is like Joan of Arc. It's like, and of course it's at the scene of the cathedral. Yeah. Which is, but it's all going back to, like ancient superstition and stuff like this.
And it shows once again the influence in other films, because I think this is clearly an antecedent for the 1931 Frankenstein, where in an incident that's not in the book, the angry villagers as a mob come and seize the monster and basically burn him, in a sequence that's visualized very similarly to this, showing how Metropolis was seeding itself into Hollywood at that time.
There's later on the cathedral, you actually see the influence The Hunchback of Notre Dame too, and the gargoyles come from Notre Dame itself. I mean, the idea.
So originally, well, I don't know. Lottie Eisner says that the original plan was that during this furious climax, that the seven deadly sins were once again going to loose upon the city, and that there would be these supernatural visions of chaos along with this other stuff, and the gargoyles were going to come to life and attack the town.
Oh, but yeah, Tom Gunning writes about this. He cites Peter Bogdanovich's long interview with Fritz Lang in the 60s. When Lang talked about an earlier version of the script that accounts for much of the medieval imagery. Let me quote from it. Mrs. von Harbo and I put in the script for Metropolis a battle between modern science and occultism, the science of the medieval ages. The magician was the evil behind all the things that happened. In one scene, all the bridges were falling down, there were flames, and out of a Gothic church came all these ghosts and ghouls and beasties. And I said, no, I cannot do this. Today I would do it, but in those days I did not have the courage. Slowly we cut out all the magic, and perhaps for that reason I had the feeling the Metropolis was patched together. Now it seems likely that's what he's referring to.
Yeah.
But of course we can't be sure, because I'm sure the script went through different phases, but that's what it seems like he's talking about.
But you do have at the end of when he's having his visions in the bed and she is giving her erotic dance in the nightclub, and he's seeing the seven deadly sins, but there's that intermingling of the actual events with the supernatural visions, and there isn't such an intermingling here. These are the things that are really happening, and it would have, I think, really changed the movie if you had supernatural visions that weren't happening, that were purely metaphorical, mixed in with this stuff.
Yeah, it's true, but I think it's sort of like, given how overloaded the film is already, it might have become.
I'm not saying it would have been good. No. I'm not advocating for that at all.
Kind of incoherent, sort of. But nonetheless interesting.
And similarly, another thing that gets reported as having been planned for the movie, and have no idea how far into the planning stages it is, or if it's a fair memory, but Lang said something about that at the end, Frater and Maria were going to go off on a rocket ship. I mean, how would that have fit into this movie at all?
Paving the way, therefore, for Woman in the Moon.
Woman in the Moon, yes.
Second sci-fi movie, which was, I think, his last silent film, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
In that case, he went out of his way to be very scientific.
Yes.
So it was very different from what you could say.
It's more conventionally sci-fi than this is.
So now we've got choreography too.
Yeah.
People barely dancing.
So Lang tossed that first flaming brigand onto the fire in person.
Yeah, and of course it's one thing that comes up in a lot of his films is the fact that he liked to include shots of his own hand often.
Mm-hmm.
It's very funny, but he's very. It was his way of almost like a signature, the way that Hitchcock would, except that it would be invisible.
An unrecognizable signature, just a personal in-joke.
I was just thinking, given all this delirium, maybe this might be a good time to just quote a brief passage of the purple passage of the writing in Harbo's novel. He ran like a blind animal, groaning aloud. He found that he was running in a circle, always upon his own tracks, but he could not get free of it, could not get out of this cursed circle. He ran in the purple mist of his own blood, which filled his eyes and ears, heard the breaker of his blood dash against his brain, heard high above, like the singing of birds, the sweetly, deadly, wicked laugh of Maria. A lot of the novel reads like this, actually.
Yes.
And in a way, it's kind of fun, but it's also like reading, a little bit like reading H.P. Lovecraft, I guess.
Yeah, it's very very delirious writing.
And some people call that high, expressionist writing too, which I guess it is in a way.
Well, this is not apropos of anything on screen right now, but it's something to mention. We've talked about the creative contributions of Lang versus von Harbo and how sometimes one or the other gets downgraded or given the wrong attribution for things. But I think Palmer's role in this also deserves some credit because he was a very interesting style of producer, a very unusual style of producer in that he wasn't inserting himself into the process very dominantly. He didn't put a lot of restrictions on his directors. He very much wanted to cultivate the director as a star. And the idea of German Expressionism was a creative wasn't just a creative thing, it was a commercial strategy. It was a way of giving a brand identity to UFOS films that would mark them as special.
Yes.
So
which,
we
of course,
see his hand
which
in
worked to
this.
some extent, because when you think of things like The Last Laugh and the kind of impact that had, and later even bringing over Murnau to make Sunrise, and which was not long after this film was made.
So I think the visual strategy behind these movies and their extravagance has a lot to do with Palmer's influence as well.
Yeah, so it wasn't, in other words, it's often seen as foolhardy, but the point is there was a logic, commercial logic behind it. And of course, if you think in long-range terms, it was a commercial logic that became valid and indicated.
Oh, absolutely. People still talk about German silent cinema, Weimar cinema. That is a coherent genre of film, more so than any other silent film industry at the time. You couldn't talk about a coherent identity for American silent film. There's there's genres. There's slapstick comedy.
Look, there's the Gorgons.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I ought to mention, she's doing her own stunts through all of this, and it's a 12-foot drop below the parapet that she's going to be running along, trying to escape from Rotvang. And she didn't want to do it. I mean, she was just absolutely terrorized. One false step, and it's a mattress that you fall onto, but even still, 12 feet, that's not a
I hope she got a lot of money for doing this movie.
Well, it certainly built her a successful career for a while, but like when she was hanging on the ringing bell a moment ago, that's really her, and she got serious bruises on her legs from being beat along the side of the staircase doing that.
Yeah, it's funny, one of the first in-jokes you get, references in movies, when Long made Spies later, he actually has posters from Metropolis, that crop up in it.
Yeah.
In a way, this is an old-fashioned, serial climax.
Yeah.
This would be like one of the real literal cliffhangers,
Right. Okay, so here's the gesture as his hands go up to his head. And that's a repeated gesture. He put his hands on his head once before in the film, and that was when he was shown, when he was encountering Rotvang in his house for the first time, and they were discussing the reincarnation of hell and bringing the robot out. So, in moments of extreme emotion, Alfred Abel's character's response is to put his hands to his head. And this is another example of the choreography that is fantastic to look at, but not really logical as a real-world thing. The way these groups break apart so that there is this empty circle around Fredersen that gives him, like a platform to sit on.
It's almost like Busby Berkeley staging,
Yeah.
Which is so close to Long because of those overhead shots. It's like it's the decorative patterns that are created by these. And it's interesting now that women are sort of becoming, because now that there's all this weeping and wailing, they're becoming very prominent.
Yeah.
And in terms of as background figures for almost, for the first time. It's the actual dissolution of the false Maria in the fire actually reminds me of another H.G. Wells, by the way, The Invisible Man, when he dies. It's sort of like that the true self emerges.
Yeah, that's a recurring thing. You can't see a Dr. Jekyll movie or a werewolf movie in which the monster, once it's dead, doesn't turn back into its human form. I've always wondered what was.
Well, this is turning back into its robot form.
Right, but turning back into your real self. That there's the transformed self and your real self, and when you're dead, you turn back into your real self. So that once the robot's dead, it's going to look like a machine again. So that's 12 feet up.
He's still got his hands on his head.
I don't blame him. It's a little thrilling. Right?
Usually, he's the most restrained of the actors, but not here.
But also the way the crowd surged as one, but he and Slim are standing there. So everybody else is moving like a wave, and now they're all running, but the three of them stand there. It's beautiful choreography, because it's just absolutely expressive.
We don't even know why they're running, do we?
Yeah, what are they going to go do?
And it's very interesting, those shadowy patterns, too.
Now his hair is white.
It's interesting how his tie is still very carefully knotted. It's like he never lets down his... He never seems like unkempt. even in his moments of greatest stress. He looks a lot like and the director Antonioni to me.
Oh, and now he runs. He runs like Frater does. Sudden bolt.
Yeah.
He and Frater have been given a visual connection now. And you're right. You made the parallel to Batman before, which similarly ends. The Tim Burton Batman ends in a church belfry like this. The bad guy is tossed from the parapet. The heroes are united. It's a parallel imagery.
Yeah, and okay, here we have like one of the last real decorative patterns for the crowd, which is now supposed to be positive, but they're just as faceless and as...
the same zombie staccato walk
and I don't
that they
know
did
what
at the beginning.
makes them want to take the shape of a triangle, but it's...
And you mentioned before that this represents the triumph of middle management.
Well, it's funny because the person who's sort of like who becomes the link here is actually a spy. It's sort of like the worker is represented by the person who's spying and betraying the workers.
Yes.
So it's more gibberish, really, even though it's supposed to be something to do with the hand and the heart and the brain, and it's like. And as I say, it's even to the credit of the novel that it doesn't end this way. That the novel ends with, sort of like Peterson discovering that his wife forgave him and actually was in love with him and not with Rotvang before she died. And of course, the mother doesn't even deliver the letter until this moment because she's finally forgiven him because he's seen the error of his ways. It's, in a way, it's just an absurd conclusion. But it's not pretending to be political. I think that's the difference.
And the way Grot keeps shuffling his hand like he's not quite sure. I don't know what if I hold my hand out, and I can't help but think of Groucho in Duck Soup, going through that mental analysis. Well, what if I hold out my hand and he doesn't shake it?
Well, Groucho is smart. This guy is sort of like a dumb peasant. I think that's the point.
Yeah. But it comes across comic to me when I know it shouldn't. Yeah. I'm reading a comic element into it that's not meant to be there.
Well, no, but the hero is not supposed to be comic either. It's like he's comic virtually throughout.
But after the emotionalism of the city's been destroyed, the children were in danger, people were falling off at the top of roofs, you need a happy ending somehow to sort of get people's heart rates back down before they leave the theater.
Yeah. So I think Hans is right. It's just like the psychiatrist at the end of Psycho.
Yeah. Well, we have reached the end of 150 minutes, and the closest thing to being there in January 10th, 1927, I think any of us are ever going to get. It's like a time machine in a box.
Yes, and I think they did a wonderful job on this restoration, given all the difficulties they had in assembling it.
Yeah, fantastic. I've really enjoyed watching it with you.
Me too.